I begin tonight in a place both ancient and ever new, a threshold where human imagination first reached beyond the limits of flesh and bone, where the dream of creating life from lifeless materials took its earliest form. There is something quietly profound about standing at the edge of history, looking back across thousands of years to find the same yearning that drives us still, the desire to build something that moves on its own, that thinks, that acts, that mirrors in some small way the mystery of being alive. Long before the word robot existed, long before circuits and sensors and silicon chips, there were hands shaping clay and wood and bronze into figures that seemed almost ready to breathe, almost ready to step forward into the world of the living, in the dim workshops of antiquity, by the flicker of oil lamps and the glow of forge fires, artisans and philosophers bent over their creations, not merely crafting tools, but attempting something far stranger and more wonderful. They were trying to answer a question that still echoes through laboratories and research centers today. What does it mean to create something that moves without being alive? The earliest traces are fragments now, mentions in texts that have survived fire and flood, and the slow erosion of centuries, stories of mechanical birds that sang, of bronze servants that poured wine at banquets, of golden maidens who assisted the gods themselves. These accounts float down to us through time like leaves on a dark river, beautiful, mysterious, impossible to verify completely, yet persistent in their presence across cultures and continents. There is something almost dreamlike about imagining these first attempts. The temple of Hephaestus in ancient Greece, where some say automated tripods rolled forward on their own, serving the divine smith god who forged wonders in his celestial workshop, the gardens of ancient China, where Han Dynasty texts speak of mechanical orchestras performing for emperors, instruments playing themselves as if guided by invisible hands. Whether these machines truly existed as described, or whether they were legends grown larger with each retelling, hardly matters in this moment. What matters is the impulse behind them, the human mind reaching toward a possibility that seemed to defy the natural order, creating motion without muscle, action without volition, purpose without consciousness. In Alexandria, in the centuries before the Common Era, a brilliant mind named Hero created devices that astonished those who witnessed them, doors that opened by themselves when altar fires were lit, mechanical theaters where tiny figures acted out entire plays, driven by falling weights and flowing water and the clever arrangement of ropes and pulleys. These were not practical tools for daily labor. They were demonstrations, proof of concept, evidence that the boundary between the living and the unliving was perhaps more permeable than anyone had imagined. The mechanisms were elegant in their simplicity, water heating in a sealed chamber, expanding, creating pressure that pushed through hidden tubes, moving levers, turning wheels. The magic was really mathematics, physics understood and harnessed, transformed into movement that seemed spontaneous, almost alive. And in those moments when the temple doors swung open of their own accord, or when the mechanical birds spread their wings and sang their pneumatic songs, observers must have felt something shift in their understanding of what was possible, a crack appearing in the wall between imagination and reality, between the world as it was and the world as it might someday become. These early automatons were not robots in the modern sense. They had no anti-intelligence, no ability to sense their environment or adapt their behavior. They were elaborate clockwork dreams, preset performances that unfolded according to fixed patterns. But they were also something more. They were the first human attempts to encode action and purpose into inanimate matter, to create artificial agency, even if that agency was limited and predetermined. Centuries would pass, empires would rise and crumble, knowledge would be lost and rediscovered. But this dream persisted, quietly, stubbornly, like a seed waiting for the right conditions to finally germinate and grow. The thread of this story winds forward through the medieval world, where Islamic scholars preserved and expanded upon Greek knowledge, translating texts, building upon ancient foundations, creating new wonders in the courts of caliphs and sultans. In the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, during the 9th and 10th centuries, engineer-inventors like the Banu Musa brothers crafted elaborate automated devices. Their book of ingenious devices described more than 100 mechanical marvels, fountains that changed shape, lamps that adjusted their own flames, mechanical servants that poured drinks without spilling a drop. There was a practical genius in these creations, but also a kind of poetry. Understanding that machines could delight as well as serve, that the act of automation itself held a kind of enchantment. Al-Jazari, working in the 12th century, created what might be called the most sophisticated automata of the medieval world. His famous elephant clock combined mechanics with artistry, a tribute to the interconnected cultures of his time, featuring figures from Indian, Egyptian, Greek, and Arabian traditions, all moving in synchronized harmony to mark the passing hours. But perhaps his most remarkable creation was something simpler and more profound, a programmable automaton, a boat with mechanical musicians that could be reprogrammed to play different rhythms by rearranging pegs on a cylinder. This was not just automation, it was reconfigurable automation, a machine that could be taught to perform different tasks without rebuilding its fundamental structure. The significance of this innovation would not be fully realized for centuries, but the seed was planted. The idea that a machine's behavior could be changed through instruction rather than reconstruction, that information and mechanism could be separated and recombined. In medieval Europe, as knowledge began to filter westward through translation and trade, clockwork became the dominant metaphor and mechanism for automated movement. The great cathedral clocks of the 14th century were marvels of engineering, intricate assemblies of gears and weights and escapements that not only marked time but staged elaborate performances in Strasbourg, in Prague, in Wells and Canterbury. Mechanical figures emerged from clock towers at appointed hours, apostles marching in procession, knights jousting on rotating platforms, roosters crowing, death striking his bell. These were public spectacles, demonstrations that human ingenuity could capture and control the most fundamental force of all, the inexorable flow of time itself. The clockwork mechanism became a way of understanding the universe. Philosophers began to wonder if perhaps the entire cosmos operated like an enormous clock set in motion by a divine clockmaker, running according to precise mathematical laws, each gear turning the next, cause and effect linked in an unbroken chain. This mechanical philosophy would shape thinking about both the universe and about life itself. If the heavens were clockwork, might living creatures also be understood as elaborate machines? complex arrangements of parts working in harmony, their apparent agency perhaps nothing more than the complex unfolding of mechanical necessity. In the Renaissance, as art and science began to merge in new ways, the creation of automata became both entertainment and exploration. Leonardo da Vinci sketched designs for mechanical knights, self-propelled carts, programmable drums. His notebooks reveal a mind fascinated by the possibility of an artificial movement, studying birds to understand flight, dissecting bodies to understand muscle and bone, always seeking the principles that might be captured and recreated in wood and metal. Some of his designs were built, most remained as drawings, visions waiting for technology to catch up with imagination. But they represent a crucial moment in this unfolding story, the moment when creating artificial beings became not just the work of craftsmen, but the province of artists and thinkers who saw in these mechanisms something profound about the nature of life and motion and intelligence itself. By the 17th and 18th centuries, automata had reached an extraordinary level of sophistication. In the workshops of master craftsmen across Europe, mechanical beings emerged that could write, draw, play, musical instruments with apparent feeling and skill. Jacques de Vaucanson created a mechanical duck that could eat, digest, and excrete, a shocking simulacrum of biological processes rendered in clockwork and rubber tubing. He also built a flute player whose fingers moved across the instrument just as a human's would, whose mechanical lungs actually blew air through the mouthpiece, producing real music through real physics, rather than hidden music boxes. The Jacques Draws family in Switzerland created 3 automata that still function today, preserved treasures that continue to write messages, draw pictures, play the organ. Watching them perform even now, centuries later, produces an uncanny sensation. These are not living, yet they move with such grace and apparent purpose. The writer, the most complex of the 3, could be programmed to write any message up to 40 characters long by adjusting small cams inside its mechanism. Each letter required specific movements, the quill dipping in ink, the hand moving just so, the eyes following the progress across the page. It was a marvel of a miniaturization and precision, containing more than 6,000 parts working in perfect coordination. These creations occupied a strange territory in the public imagination. They were clearly machines, yet they mimicked life so convincingly that they seemed to blur the boundaries. They were philosophical provocations dressed in silk and powered by springs, asking their audiences to consider what separated the mechanical from the living, the programmed from the conscious. Some found them delightful, marvels of human ingenuity that demonstrated the heights of craftsmanship and understanding. Others found them disturbing, uncanny, too close to the sacred mystery of life. Debates raged in salons and universities. Could a machine ever truly think? Could it feel? Where did mechanism end and consciousness begin? René Descartes had argued that animals were merely complex automata, biological machines without true consciousness. Only humans, with their immortal souls, possessed genuine awareness. But if an automaton could be built that perfectly mimicked human behavior, how would one know the difference? How could consciousness be detected or proven? These were not idle philosophical games. They cut to the heart of what it meant to be human, what it meant to think and feel and choose. and the automata of the 18th century, with their eerily lifelike movements and behaviors, made these questions urgent and immediate rather than abstract and distant. Meanwhile, a different kind of mechanism was emerging, one that would prove far more consequential than even the most sophisticated automaton. The textile industry in England was being transformed by machines that automated the weaving process. The jacquard loom, introduced in 1801, used punched cards to control the pattern of the weave, creating intricate designs without requiring the weaver to manually select each thread. This might seem distant from the story of mechanical birds and writing automatons, but it represents a crucial conceptual leap. The punched cards were a form of programming, a way of encoding complex instructions that a machine could read and execute. The pattern existed separate from the mechanism, information that could be changed without changing the machine itself. Charles Babbage saw the connection. Watching the jacquard loom operate, he envisioned a machine that could perform mathematical calculations in the same way, reading instructions from punched cards, executing operations in sequence, storing intermediate results, producing final answers. His analytical engine, designed in the 1830s but never completed in his lifetime, was conceptually a computer. It had memory, a processing unit he called the mill, input and output mechanisms, and it could be programmed with cards to perform different calculations. It was a general-purpose machine, not locked into a single task, but capable of being instructed to solve various problems. Ada Lovelace, working with Babbage, saw even further. She recognized that such a machine need not be limited to numbers, that it might manipulate any information that could be encoded, symbols, logic, perhaps even creating music or art. She wrote what is now recognized as the first computer program, a sequence of operations for calculating Bernoulli numbers, and in doing so, glimpsed a future where machines would become partners in intellectual work. This was automation of a different order, not the mimicry of the physical actions, but the mechanization of thought itself, or at least of certain kinds of logical reasoning and calculation. The distinction between these two paths, physical automation and information processing, would persist for more than a century before finally converging in ways that neither Babbage nor Lovelace could have imagined. As the 19th century progressed, the Industrial Revolution transformed the relationship between humans and machines. Factories filled with mechanical looms, steam hammers, automated cutting tools. This was not the delicate clockwork of drawing-room automata, but massive, powerful machinery that could outpace human workers by vast margins. The machines were not intelligent, but they were tireless. They did not grow weary or distracted. They performed the same operation again and again with perfect consistency. In doing so, they changed the nature of work, the structure of society, the rhythm of daily life. Some saw liberation in this, humans freed from repetitive drudgery to pursue higher callings. Others saw displacement and dehumanization, workers reduced to tenders of machines, their skills made obsolete, their labor devalued. The Luddites, often misunderstood as simply opposed to technology, were actually resisting a particular arrangement of power and profit. They did not object to machines themselves, but to machines used to drive down wages and eliminate skilled craftwork. Their rebellion was economic and social more than technological. But the march of mechanization could not be stopped by broken looms. The logic was too compelling. the advantages too great. Automation spread from textiles to every industry. Each generation of machines more capable, more complex, more integrated into the fabric of modern life. Yet these industrial machines, powerful as they were, remained tools. They had no autonomy, no ability to sense their environment or adjust their behavior. They did what they were built to do, nothing more, nothing less. The dream of creating truly autonomous machines, beings that could perceive and think and act independently, that dream still belonged to the realm of fiction and philosophy, waiting for new technologies and new insights to make it possible. The 20th century arrived with electricity crackling through new wires, with radio waves carrying voices across impossible distances, with the first tentative flights of heavier-than-air machines. The world was being remade by technologies that would have seemed like sorcery just decades before. And in this atmosphere of transformation, the idea of artificial beings began to shift from philosophical curiosity to scientific possibility. The word robot itself entered human language in 1920, coined by Czech writer Karel Čapek in his play R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots. The word came from robota, meaning forced labor, and the play told a dark story of artificial workers who eventually rebel against their creators. This theme, the created turning against the creator, was not new. Mary Shelley had explored it a century earlier in Frankenstein, but Čapek's play crystallized something in the public imagination, gave a name to the mechanical servants that had haunted human dreams for millennia: robots, artificial workers, beings made rather than born. The 1920s and 30s saw a flowering of imaginative visions in film, in pulp magazines, in World's Fair exhibitions. Robots appeared as gleaming metal figures, sometimes benevolent, often threatening. They captured anxieties about industrialization, about the replacement of human workers, about the potential consequences of creating intelligence without wisdom, life without soul. But these were still fantasies. The actual machines being built were far less dramatic. In factories, automated assembly lines were becoming more sophisticated. Henry Ford's production system broke complex manufacturing into simple, repeatable steps that could be performed by specialized machines and semi-skilled workers. The assembly line itself became a kind of distributed machine, each station performing one operation before passing the work to the next. This was automation through organization as much as through technology, but it established patterns that would prove crucial. The idea that complex tasks could be broken into simple sequences, that standardization enabled mechanization, that systems could be designed where machines and humans each contributed what they did best. World War II accelerated technological development in ways both terrible and profound. The need to calculate artillery trajectories, to break encrypted messages, to coordinate vast logistical operations, all of this demanded computational power beyond what human calculators could provide. ENIAC, the electronic numerical integrator and computer, emerged from this crucible in 1946. It filled an entire room, used 18,000 vacuum tubes, consumed enough electricity to dim the lights in an entire neighborhood when powered on. But it could perform calculations thousands of times faster than any human or any mechanical calculator. This was not a robot in the physical sense. It could not move or manipulate objects, but it represented something equally important, the automation of thinking, or at least of certain kinds of logical operations and mathematical processes. Information could be processed, transformed, according to programmed instructions. The connections to Ada Lovelace's insights a century earlier were direct, though largely forgotten at the time. The principle was the same: a general-purpose machine that could be programmed to perform different tasks by changing its instructions rather than its physical structure. As computers evolved through the 1950s, becoming faster, more reliable, more compact, a new possibility emerged. What if computers could be connected to mechanical devices? What if the information processing power of computation could be combined with the physical capability of machines? What if robots could have brains? At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, researchers began experimenting with machines that could sense their environment and respond, not through pre-programmed clockwork sequences, but through feedback and computation. A machine with sensors could gather information about the world, process that information, and adjust its behavior accordingly. This was cybernetics, a term coined by Norbert Wiener to describe the science of control and communication in animals and machines. The key insight was feedback, the idea that a system could monitor its own output and adjust its behavior to achieve desired results. A thermostat was a simple cybernetic device, sensing temperature, comparing it to a target, turning heating on or off to minimize the difference. But the same principle could be applied to far more complex systems. A machine arm could sense the position of an object, calculate the movements needed to grasp it, execute those movements, sense any errors, and correct them. This was a fundamentally different kind of automation than the rigid sequences of earlier machines. In 1954, George Devol filed a patent for a programmable manipulator, a mechanical arm that could be taught to perform sequences of movements and repeat them with precision. This was not the stuff of science fiction, no gleaming humanoid form, just an industrial tool. But it was the beginning of the robotics industry as we know it today. Devol partnered with Joseph Engelberger, an engineer and entrepreneur who saw the potential for these machines in manufacturing. Together, they founded Unimation, the first robotics company, and in 1961, they installed the first industrial robot in a General Motors plant in New Jersey. The robot, named Unimate, was used to extract die castings from a molding machine and weld them to automobile bodies. Dangerous work in a hot, harsh environment. The robot did not complain about the conditions, did not take breaks, did not make mistakes from fatigue or distraction. It simply performed the same movements, thousands of times each shift, with consistent precision. This was not meant to inspire wonder. It was meant to increase productivity and reduce costs. But it worked, and it opened a door. Within years, industrial robots were spreading through factories, performing welding, painting, assembly, material handling, each generation becoming more capable, more precise, more versatile. The robots of the 1960s and 70s were still quite limited. They were essentially programmable arms, blind and deaf to their surroundings, following pre-programmed paths with precision but without understanding. If something unexpected happened, if a part was not quite where it should be, the robot would blindly continue its programmed motions, often with disastrous results. But they proved the concept. Automation was no longer limited to simple, repetitive motions in fixed sequences. Machines could be programmed to perform complex tasks and reprogrammed when those tasks changed. The flexibility that Al-Jazari had glimpsed in his programmable musical boat 8 centuries earlier was finally being realized at industrial scale. Meanwhile, in research laboratories, scientists were pursuing a different kind of robotics, machines that could move through the world, navigate obstacles, interact with unpredictable environments. This required not just mechanical capability, but perception, intelligence, decision-making. At the Stanford Research Institute in the late 1960s, a robot called Shaky became the first to combine mobility, perception, and artificial intelligence. Shaky could see through a television camera, reason about its environment, plan a path from one location to another, and execute that plan by rolling across the laboratory floor. Shaky was slow, painfully slow by later standards. It would stop to think for minutes at a time, processing what it saw, planning its next move. Then it would roll forward a bit and stop again. Its name came from its tendency to wobble as it moved, but it represented a breakthrough. Here was a machine that could sense, think, and act in a loop, that could adapt its behavior based on what it perceived. The challenges were immense. Vision turned out to be extraordinarily difficult. Humans take for granted the ability to instantly recognize objects, judge distances, understand three-dimensional structure from two-dimensional images. But programming a computer to do the same required solving problems that went to the heart of perception and cognition. What is an edge? How do you distinguish object from background? How do you recognize the same object from different angles, in different lighting, partially obscured? These questions had seemed simple until researchers tried to teach machines to see. Then they revealed themselves as profound mysteries of neural processing and pattern recognition. Similarly, navigation in unknown environments required building mental maps, remembering where you had been, planning paths that avoided obstacles, updating those plans when the world turned out to be different than expected. All of this happened automatically in animal brains, but had to be explicitly programmed into machines. Progress was slow, but steady. Each decade brought more capable robots, better sensors, faster computers, more sophisticated algorithms. By the 1980s, robots were beginning to appear in more diverse settings, not just factory floors, but laboratories, hospitals, hazardous environments where humans could not safely go. In 1986, a robot named Hero explored the inside of the damaged Chernobyl reactor, going where radiation levels would have killed a human in minutes. It could not prevent the disaster, but it provided information that helped contain it, showed what had happened in those sealed chambers. This was a new role for machine, one not replacing human workers, but extending human reach into places too dangerous for flesh and blood. The 1990s brought another shift as the internet began connecting computers worldwide, as processing power continued its exponential growth, as new approaches to artificial intelligence emerged from the limitations of earlier rule-based systems. Machine learning, the idea that computers could improve their performance through experience rather than explicit programming, began to show promise. Instead of trying to write down all of the rules for recognizing a face or understanding speech, researchers began creating systems that could learn patterns from vast amounts of data. Neural networks, inspired by the structure of biological brains, could be trained to perform tasks that had resisted traditional programming approaches. At the same time, robots were becoming more mechanically sophisticated. Honda unveiled Asimo in 2000, a humanoid robot that could walk, climb stairs, navigate around obstacles. Its movements were fluid, almost graceful, a far cry from the lurching stiffness of earlier walking robots. The choice to build humanoid robots, machines with legs and arms, and heads roughly analogous to human proportions, was partly practical and partly symbolic. Practical because the world had been built for human bodies, stairs and doorways and tools, all designed for our form. A humanoid robot could potentially navigate spaces and use objects designed for humans. But it was also symbolic, a continuation of that ancient impulse to create artificial beings in our own image, to see our form reflected in our creations. The dream of the mechanical human, present in Greek myths and medieval legends, was being pursued with servomotors and gyroscopes instead of bronze and clockwork, but the underlying vision remained recognizable across the millennia. Yet for all these advances, robots remained confined to controlled environments, factories where everything was precisely positioned, laboratories where conditions could be managed. The messy, unpredictable real world was still largely beyond their capabilities. A robot could weld car frames with perfect precision on an assembly line, but could not pick up your groceries from a cluttered refrigerator, could not navigate a crowded sidewalk, could not understand that when you asked for a glass of water, you meant the container, not the material. Context, common sense, the accumulated understanding that humans develop from living in the world, these remained elusive. The 2000s brought gradual progress on many fronts. Sensors became cheaper and more capable. Cameras could capture high-resolution images at high frame rates. LiDAR systems could map three-dimensional spaces with millimeter precision, accelerometers, and gyroscopes, tiny enough to fit in smartphones, could track motion and orientation. Computing power continued its relentless growth, following the pattern that Gordon Moore had observed decades earlier. Processors that once filled rooms now fit on chips smaller than a fingernail and were thousands of times more powerful. This meant robots could carry their computational brains with them, could process sensor data in real time, could run increasingly sophisticated algorithms without being tethered to remote computers, and machine learning was beginning to transform what was possible. In 2012, a neural network trained on millions of images achieved a dramatic breakthrough in visual recognition, suddenly outperforming all previous approaches. This sparked an explosion of interest and investment in deep learning, the use of large neural networks trained on vast data sets. Within a few years, these techniques were being applied to robotics. Robots could learn to grasp unfamiliar objects by trying thousands of times and gradually improving, could recognize people and understand speech, could navigate complex environments by building on experience rather than following predetermined rules. The distinction between programmed behavior and learned behavior was becoming blurred. A modern robot might have some capabilities that were explicitly coded, designed by engineers who understood exactly how they worked, but it might also have capabilities that emerged from training, patterns, discovered in data that even the robot's creators could not fully explain. This created new possibilities, but also new uncertainties. A traditional programmed robot was predictable. You could trace through its code and understand exactly why it did what it did. A learning robot might develop strategies that worked but were opaque, black boxes that produced results without offering clear explanations. In warehouses, robots were beginning to work alongside humans in new ways. Amazon's acquisition of Kiva Systems in 2012 brought mobile robots into distribution centers, where they would slide under shelves and carry them to human workers for picking. The robots handled the heavy lifting and the navigation. Humans handled the recognition and grasping of individual items, each doing what they did best, working in collaboration rather than isolation. This model, humans and robots working together, represented a shift from earlier visions of full automation. Instead of replacing workers entirely, robots could augment human capabilities, handle the dangerous or tedious aspects, while humans contributed judgment, dexterity, adaptability. Collaborative robots or cobots were designed specifically for this purpose. They had sensors to detect nearby humans, would slow or stop if someone got too close, could be easily programmed by demonstration. A worker could physically guide the robot's arm through the desired motion, and the robot would remember and repeat it. No programming expertise required. The barriers to adoption were falling. Robots were becoming more affordable, more versatile, easier to deploy. Small and medium manufacturers could now justify the investment, could reprogram robots for different products, could integrate automation without completely redesigning their facilities. Meanwhile, TQD, in research laboratories and tech companies, more ambitious projects were underway. Boston Dynamics created robots that could run, jump, do backflips. Their movements were uncannily animal-like, the result of sophisticated balance control and dynamic motion planning. Videos of their robots navigating obstacle courses or recovering from being pushed went viral, generating equal measures of amazement and unease. The unease was telling. These machines moved too well, too naturally. They triggered something primal, a sense that the boundary between machine and organism was being transgressed. That ancient uncanny valley that the automata makers of the 18th century had discovered was still there, amplified by the increased capability and realism of modern robots. Self-driving vehicles represented another frontier, combining sensors, computation, and machine learning to navigate roads without human control. Companies poured billions into development, testing autonomous cars on public roads, accumulating millions of miles of experience. The technical challenges were formidable, but gradually yielding to sustained effort. Cars could recognize pedestrians, read signs, predict the behavior of other vehicles, navigate complex intersections, but the problem was not just technical, it was also social, ethical, legal. When should an autonomous vehicle prioritize the safety of its passengers versus pedestrians? Who was liable when accidents occurred? How much reliability was enough? These questions had no easy answers. They forced society to confront the implications of delegating decisions to machines, decisions that had moral dimensions, that involved weighing competing values, trading off risks. In 2020, the COVID pandemic created unexpected opportunities for robotics. In hospitals, Robots could deliver supplies, disinfect rooms with ultraviolet light, reducing exposure for healthcare workers. In warehouses and delivery networks, robots helped manage surges in online shopping. Suddenly, the value of the machines that could work without risk of infection became clear and urgent, but the pandemic also revealed limitations. Robots were still highly specialized. A delivery robot could not easily be repurposed for disinfection. An assembly line robot could not retool itself to produce ventilators instead of automobiles. The flexibility that humans took for granted, the ability to quickly learn new tasks and adapt to changing circumstances, remained largely beyond machine capability. Recent years have seen continued rapid development across multiple dimensions. Humanoid robots from companies like Tesla and Figure are being designed for general-purpose work, promise to perform a wide variety of tasks in human environments. Quadrupeds are being deployed for inspection and surveillance in industrial facilities. Small drones can navigate GPS-denied environments, mapping caves and buildings, and artificial intelligence continues to advance in ways that complement physical robotics. Large language models can understand and generate natural language with remarkable fluency, can reason through complex problems, can learn from examples and instructions. The question of how to integrate these capabilities with physical embodiment, how to create robots that can understand commands, plan actions, and execute them in the real world is actively being explored. There is a sense of acceleration, of multiple threads converging. Machine learning provides perception and decision-making. Better actuators and sensors provide physical capability. Cheaper computation makes it all economically feasible. The robots being deployed today would have been science fiction just a decade or two ago, and what seems impossible now may be commonplace in another decade. Yet certain challenges remain stubborn. Manipulation, the ability to grasp and handle diverse objects with human-like dexterity, is still difficult. Our hands are marvels of evolution, sensitive, strong, capable of both power grips and precision movements. Replicating that versatility in mechanical form has proven extraordinarily difficult. Energy is another constraint. Batteries have improved, but still limit how long robots can operate untethered. A human can work for hours on a meal's worth of energy. A robot with similar capabilities might need to recharge after less than an hour. The energy density of biological systems, honed by billions of years of evolution, remains far superior to our best batteries. And common sense, that deep understanding of how the world works, accumulated through lived experience, remains largely absent in machines. A robot might be able to navigate a room, but not understand that a chair is something to sit on, that a cup filled with liquid should be kept upright, that fragile objects need gentle handling, all the implicit knowledge that humans absorb from living in the world, that we apply automatically without conscious thought, has to be explicitly taught or learned by machines through extensive experience. As we stand now, in the mid-2020s, robotics is in a strange intermediate state. Robots are common in factories, increasingly present in warehouses and hospitals, beginning to appear in homes, yet still far from the capable. Autonomous beings of science fiction, they excel at specific tasks in controlled settings, struggle with variability and uncertainty. The trajectory is clear. Capabilities are expanding. Costs are falling, Applications are multiplying, but the timeline remains uncertain. Will we see truly general-purpose robots, machines that can handle the full range of tasks in human environments within a decade, within a generation, or will there always be a gap, certain capabilities that remain uniquely biological, uniquely human? The story of robotics is not yet complete, cannot yet be told in past tense alone. It continues to unfold, driven by the same impulse that motivated ancient craftsmen shaping bronze birds, the desire to create something that moves on its own, that acts with apparent purpose and intelligence, that extends our capabilities beyond the limitations of our own bodies, from heroes' steam-powered temple doors to factory robots welding car frames, from Vaucanson's mechanical duck to Mars rovers exploring alien landscapes, from Babbage's analytical engine to modern machine learning systems, the thread runs unbroken. Human ingenuity applied to the challenge of creating artificial agency, artificial capability, artificial life. Each generation builds on the insights and achievements of those before, standing on accumulated foundations of knowledge and technique. The pace accelerates, the capabilities expand, but the fundamental questions remain. What does it mean to create something that acts independently? Where is the boundary between tool and agent, between programmed behavior and genuine intelligence, between mechanism and mind? These questions take on new urgency as robots become more capable, more autonomous, more present in our daily lives. They are no longer philosophical abstractions, but practical concerns that shape policy, economics, ethics, employment, security, the very structure of society. And yet, beneath all the technical achievements and economic transformations, there is something deeper happening, something that speaks to the nature of creation itself, to the human need not just to make tools, but to make makers, not just to act in the world, but to create new actors. When ancient craftsmen shaped bronze into birds that seemed ready to take flight, they were not merely demonstrating mechanical skill. They were participating in an ancient dialogue between the made and the maker, asking what it means to bring forth something new into the world, something that has its own presence, its own kind of being. This impulse runs through human culture like a hidden river, surfacing in myths of golems and homunculi, in alchemical dreams of creating life from base matter, in stories of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods to animate clay. We have always wanted to be more than users of the world. We have wanted to be creators within it, to exercise the same generative power that brought us into existence. Robotics is the latest expression of this deep current, rendered now in silicon and steel rather than clay and wishes, but animated by the same fundamental yearning. And as robots become more capable, more autonomous, more apparently alive, they force us to confront questions about the nature of a life and mind that we have asked since the beginning of conscious thought. What is it that makes something alive? Is it simply complexity, a sufficient number of parts interacting in sufficiently intricate ways? Or is there some essential quality, some spark or spirit that cannot be reduced to mechanism, no matter how elaborate? A bacterium has no brain, no nervous system, yet it swims toward nutrients and away from toxins. It responds to its environment with apparent purpose. Is this intelligence or merely chemistry playing out according to physical law? And if the bacterium is just chemistry, are we not also, in the end, just chemistry of greater complexity? These questions have no final answers, or rather, they have as many answers as there are philosophical traditions and personal convictions, but robots make them concrete, embodied, urgent. When a machine can see and move and learn and adapt, when it can recognize faces and understand speech and perform tasks without explicit instruction, the distinction between living and non-living begins to blur at the edges. Perhaps the more important question is not whether robots are alive or conscious, but what our relationship with them will be, how we will share the world with beings of our own creation, beings that may eventually surpass us in certain capabilities while remaining fundamentally different in nature. There is a peculiar mirror that robots hold up to humanity in trying to create machines that can perceive and think and act. We are forced to understand our own perception, thinking, action. We must break down the seamless flow of human capability into discrete components that can be analyzed, modeled, replicated, and in doing so, we discover how much we did not understand. How does a child learn language from the scattered examples of conversation around them? How do we recognize a friend's face instantly, even in poor lighting, at an odd angle, years after last seeing them? How do we navigate a crowded room without consciously thinking about each step, each minor adjustment of balance and trajectory? These capabilities that seem effortless, automatic, turn out to be extraordinarily sophisticated, the product of millions of years of evolution, refined by natural selection into systems of stunning elegance and efficiency. Trying to replicate them artificially reveals just how remarkable they are, how much invisible complexity underlies every simple action. This humility, this recognition of the depth and subtlety of natural intelligence, is perhaps one of the most valuable gifts that robotics offers. It teaches us to appreciate the marvel of our own existence, the improbable arrangement of matter and energy that gives rise to consciousness and agency. At the same time, robotics reveals capabilities that are uniquely human, or at least uniquely biological. Robots can calculate faster, remember more, operate without rest, but they do not create meaning. They do not feel wonder or curiosity for its own sake. They do not love or dream or imagine futures that do not yet exist. Or do they? This too remains uncertain as artificial intelligence grows more sophisticated, as machines begin to exhibit behaviors that seem creative or insightful. The question becomes harder to answer with confidence. Perhaps meaning and wonder are not magical properties, but emergent phenomena, patterns that arise in sufficiently complex systems, regardless of whether those systems are biological or artificial. The future that approaches thus slowly but steadily is one where humans and robots will likely coexist in intricate relationship, neither fully separate nor fully merged. Robots will handle tasks that are dangerous or tedious, will extend our reach into environments hostile to biological life, will serve as partners in exploration and creation, but they will also challenge us economically as they automate work that humans once performed, ethically as they make decisions that affect human welfare, philosophically as they force us to reconsider what is special about human existence, what cannot be replicated or replaced. This is not a simple story of progress or decline, but something more complex, a transformation of the relationship between humanity and the tools we create, a blurring of the line between user and used, between subject and object. The robots we build will shape us even as we shape them, will change how we work and think and understand ourselves. And so the story winds back to where it began, to those ancient workshops where the first automata took form, where human hands shaped metal and wood into approximations of life. The distance traveled is immense, from heroes' steam-powered temple doors to humanoid robots that can walk and grasp and learn, from mechanical birds on fixed sequences to machines that navigate uncertain environments through perception and computation. Yet the continuity is also real. The same dream, the same impulse, the same fundamental question: can we create something that acts on its own, that has its own kind of agency, its own presence in the world? The answer has gradually shifted from no to yes, but with qualifications, with nuances, with ongoing uncertainties. Yes, we can create machines that move and sense and respond, that learn and adapt and perform tasks without constant instruction. But whether we have created something truly intelligent, truly conscious, truly alive, that remains an open question, perhaps ultimately unanswerable. What we have certainly created is a new category of being, artificial yet autonomous, programmed yet adaptive, mechanical yet capable of behavior that seems purposeful and intelligent. These entities occupy a space that did not exist before we made it, a space between the purely natural and the purely artificial, between the living and the non-living, and in that space new possibilities emerge, new relationships, new challenges, new opportunities. The robots of today are primitive compared to what will likely exist in decades to come. But they are also marvels compared to anything that existed even a generation ago. The trajectory is clear even if the destination remains uncertain. There is something quietly profound about standing at this moment in history, able to look back across millennia of dreaming and striving, able to see the arc from ancient automatons to modern artificial intelligence, able to recognize both how far we have come and how far we might yet go. The workshops are different now, filled with screens and sensors rather than forges and lathes. But the work continues. Engineers and researchers, programmers and designers, all engaged in the same fundamental project, creating artificial agents, extending the boundaries of what machines can do, exploring the edges of what is possible. And as they work, they participate in that ancient dialogue between human and creation, between imagination and reality, between the world as it is and the world as it might become. They are the latest inheritors of a tradition that stretches back to the first human who ever wondered. What if I could make something that moves on its own? The night deepens, and in laboratories around the world, robots are learning, testing, improving. Some are practicing grasps on objects they have never encountered before. Some are mapping environments they have never seen. Some are processing vast data sets, finding patterns, refining behaviors. They do this work without awareness, without pride or frustration, without the emotional texture that accompanies human effort, but they do it nonetheless, extending their capabilities incrementally, moment by moment, iteration by iteration, and tomorrow they will be slightly more capable than today, will handle tasks they could not quite manage yesterday, will move a bit closer to the vision that their creators hold. That is the nature of this endeavor: patient, accumulating, building on small improvements until they sum to transformations. The story of the robotics is ultimately a human story, a story about what we dream and what we build, about our desire to overcome limitations and extend our reach, about our creativity and our hubris, our wisdom and our blindness. It is a story still being written, still unfolding, still evolving in ways we cannot fully predict. And as consciousness itself begins to drift, as thoughts slow and soften, as the boundary between waking and sleeping grows thin and permeable, these images linger: mechanical birds and bronze servants, factory robots and Mars rovers, humanoid figures learning to walk, all of them part of one continuous thread, one long conversation between humanity and the artificial beings we create. They stand there in workshops, ancient and modern, in factories and laboratories, in stories and reality, waiting, ready, patient, as only machines can be patient, existing in that strange space between tool and agent, between programmed and autonomous, between made and making. And the dream continues quiet, persistent, reaching forward into a future we can glimpse but not quite see, where the boundaries shift, where new forms of being emerge, where the ancient impulse to create life from lifeless matter finds ever more sophisticated expression. The ancient craftsman and the modern roboticist, separated by millennia, united by vision, both shaping metal into motion, both asking the same question, both reaching toward the same impossible, beautiful, endlessly compelling dream. I close my eyes and picture a city made of stone and light, a place where marble glows beneath the Tuscan sun, where every piazza hums with voices speaking of beauty and truth and the nature of what it means to be human. The air here is warm, carrying the scent of limestone dust and pigment, the sound of chisels against marble echoing through narrow streets, and everywhere there is this sense of awakening, as though the world itself has decided to remember something it had forgotten. This is Florence, though it could be Rome or Venice or any of those Italian cities where something extraordinary began to unfold in the centuries after the year 1300, a transformation so profound that we still feel its presence, still walk through museums and libraries shaped by its vision, still carry in our minds the images it created and the questions it dared to ask. The word itself, Renaissance, means rebirth, and there is something almost magical in that notion, the idea that a civilization could be born again, that after centuries of one way of seeing and thinking and creating, humanity could choose a different path, could look backward to move forward, could find in ancient ruins and forgotten texts the seeds of something entirely new. I imagine standing in a workshop, late afternoon light streaming through tall windows, illuminating particles of marble dust that hang suspended in golden air. And there is Michelangelo, or perhaps Donatello, or some other master whose name has been lost to time, but whose hands knew the secret of transforming cold stone into living flesh. The floor is covered with drawings, sketches of human bodies in motion, studies of muscles and tendons, observations of how light falls across a shoulder or gathers in the hollow of a throat, because this is what makes the Renaissance different from what came before. This obsessive attention to the world as it actually appears, to the beauty inherent in natural form, to the dignity and complexity of the human figure. On a nearby table sits a text, perhaps Plato or Cicero or Vitruvius, the pages worn from constant study, annotated in the margins with thoughts and questions in flowing script, because the artists and thinkers of this time believed that wisdom could be found in the classical past, that the Greeks and Romans had understood something essential about proportion and harmony and the proper measure of things, and that these ancient insights had been waiting, patient as seeds in winter, for the right moment to bloom again. Through the window, I can see the dome of a cathedral rising against the sky, an impossible feat of engineering that seems to defy gravity itself, proof that human ingenuity and mathematical precision could achieve what previous generations thought beyond reach. And nearby, construction continues on a palazzo, its facade designed according to principles of symmetry and classical order, each column and arch placed with careful deliberation, each proportion calculated to create a sense of balance and grace. This is a world being remade by human hands and human minds, where the power to shape reality no longer belongs exclusively to the divine or the distant, but to the artist with a brush, the architect with a plan, the scholar with a question, the merchant with a vision of what might be possible. I walk through imagined streets where wool merchants and bankers discuss Aristotle over wine, where poets gather in gardens to debate the nature of love and beauty, where a young apprentice watches his master mix pigments and learns not just technique, but philosophy, the belief that art serves a higher purpose, that it can reveal truth, can capture the essence of things, can freeze a single moment of grace and make it eternal. The light is changing now, growing softer, more amber, and I think of how the people of this time must have experienced their world, how they must have felt this sense of possibility, this thrilling conviction that they were participating in something larger than themselves, that they were not merely living through their days, but actively shaping a new vision of what humanity could become. Somewhere nearby, a young man is reading Petrarch by candlelight, feeling the power of language arranged with precision and care, discovering that words themselves could be architecture, could be sculpted and refined until they revealed new dimensions of thought and feeling. And in another room, someone is studying the mathematics of perspective, learning how to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface, discovering the geometric rules that govern how parallel lines appear to converge, how objects diminish with distance, how the human eye makes sense of depth and volume, and in this discovery finding a way to make paintings that seem to open like windows onto another world. This is where we begin, in this atmosphere of transformation and rediscovery, in this moment when Europe emerged from centuries of different concerns and different ways of being, and chose to look at humanity, at nature, at the classical past, with new eyes and renewed wonder. The story of the Renaissance is vast, spanning centuries and countries, encompassing art and architecture, philosophy and science, politics and religion, but it begins here, in these workshops and libraries, in these cities of stone and light, where individuals dared to imagine that the world could be different, and then set about making it so. The seeds of this transformation were planted long before anyone used the word Renaissance, long before Michelangelo touched chisel to marble or Leonardo sketched his impossible machines. The roots reach back to a time when Europe was emerging from what some would later call, perhaps unfairly, the Dark Ages. It begins, as so many things do, with loss and rediscovery. For centuries, the great texts of classical antiquity had been scattered, hidden, forgotten in monastery libraries where monks copied manuscripts they could barely read, preserving words in languages that few understood, maintaining traditions they no longer fully grasped, and much had been lost entirely, burned in wars, crumbled with time, or simply abandoned as the Roman Empire collapsed and new kingdoms rose from its ruins. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, something shifted. Trade routes expanded, cities grew wealthy, and with wealth came leisure, and with leisure came curiosity, particularly in the Italian peninsula, where the memory of Rome had never entirely faded, where ancient columns still stood in fields, where the language spoken in the streets was descended directly from Latin. There began to develop a hunger for the past. Petrarch, born in the year 1304, is often called the father of humanism, the movement that would become the intellectual foundation of the Renaissance. And there is something touching about his devotion to antiquity, the way he collected ancient manuscripts with the passion of a lover, the way he wrote letters to long-dead Roman authors as though they might somehow receive them across the centuries. He climbed Mount Ventoux in 1342, not for any practical reason, but simply to see the view from the summit. And in this act, there is something emblematic of the new spirit, the idea that human experience and human perception had value in themselves, that the world was worth observing, worth describing, worth understanding on its own terms. Petrarch wrote in Latin, attempting to match the elegance of Cicero, but he also wrote poetry in the vernacular in Italian, verses about his love for a woman named Laura, and in doing so, he helped establish that the common language, the language of merchants and mothers, could carry beauty and sophistication, could be a vehicle for serious literary art. This matters more than it might seem, because language shapes thought, and when writers began to craft works of philosophy and literature in Italian, in French, in English, they made these ideas accessible to people beyond the small circle of clergy and scholars who had monopolized learning for so long. In Florence, the Medici family was accumulating the wealth that would later fuel so much artistic creation, building their fortune on banking and wool trading, establishing themselves as the unofficial rulers of the city. And though their political machinations could be ruthless, they understood something crucial, that money could be transformed into beauty, into learning, into legacy. Cosimo de' Medici, who rose to power in 1434, would become one of the great patrons of the Renaissance, but even before him, Florence had been developing the conditions necessary for transformation. The city was a republic, governed by guilds and councils rather than a single hereditary ruler, and this created space for a certain kind of civic pride, a competition among wealthy families to demonstrate their refinement and vision through public works and private patronage. The wealth flowing through Italian cities came from trade, from the textile industry, from banking innovations that allowed capital to move and multiply. Florence and Venice and Milan became hubs of commerce, connecting northern Europe with the Mediterranean, the East with the West, and this commercial success created a new class of people, merchants and bankers who were neither nobles nor peasants, who had education and ambition, who wanted to see themselves reflected in art and culture. But there was another crucial element, another stream feeding this awakening, and it came from Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire. That continuation of Rome in the East had preserved Greek texts that were largely unknown in Western Europe, had maintained traditions of classical learning that had been interrupted elsewhere, and as the Ottoman Turks pressed westward, threatening the ancient city, Byzantine scholars began to migrate to Italy, bringing with them manuscripts and knowledge, teaching Greek to eager Italian students, opening windows onto Plato and Aristotle, onto mathematical treatises and philosophical dialogues that had been inaccessible for centuries. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, it was a catastrophe, the end of an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years, but it also sent a final wave of scholars and texts westward, accelerating the recovery of classical learning that was already underway. I imagine one of these manuscripts arriving in Florence, carried carefully by a scholar who has fled his conquered homeland, the pages containing Plato's dialogues, ideas about ideal forms and the nature of beauty, and the proper education of citizens, and I imagine the excitement of the Italian humanists who could finally read these texts in their original language. Who could compare different versions? Who could engage with ancient philosophy not as distant dogma, but as living conversation? This is what humanism meant. At its core, not a rejection of Christianity, but a belief that human nature and human potential were worthy of study, that the classical past offered wisdom about how to live well, how to think clearly, how to create beauty, and that this wisdom could coexist with Christian faith, could even illuminate and enrich it. The early humanists were not revolutionaries. They were scholars and teachers, men like Coluccio Salutati and Leonardo Bruni in Florence, who served as chancellors and scribes, who wrote histories and treatises, who taught young men to read Cicero and Virgil, who believed that education in classical rhetoric and ethics would create better citizens, more virtuous leaders, a more enlightened society. They studied grammar and rhetoric, logic and moral philosophy, subjects they called the studia humanitatis, the humanities, and they believed these disciplines developed the full potential of human beings, made them more eloquent, more thoughtful, more capable of participating in civic life. In art, the early stirrings of change were equally gradual, equally rooted in observation and recovery. Giotto di Bondone, who worked in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, began to paint figures with weight and volume, with human emotions visible on their faces. His frescoes in Padua show scenes from the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary, but they show them as real people in real spaces, grieving and celebrating, suffering and rejoicing, not as flat symbols on a golden background, but as beings who inhabit the world. This was revolutionary, though it happened slowly, incrementally, each artist building on the discoveries of those who came before, learning to observe how fabric drapes over a body, how light creates shadow, how distance affects the appearance of objects, how to suggest three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface. Brunelleschi, born in 1377, would take this even further, demonstrating the mathematical principles of linear perspective, showing that there were rules governing how space could be represented, that art could be grounded in geometry, in observation, in science. He famously designed the dome of Florence Cathedral, solving an engineering problem that had stumped architects for decades. How to span that enormous space without through the temporary wooden supports that had been traditionally used. He studied Roman ruins, examined the Pantheon, and devised a double-shell dome with hidden reinforcements, a structure so innovative that people came from across Europe just to see it. Proof that human ingenuity could match or exceed the achievements of the ancients, the doors of the Florence Baptistery became the site of a famous competition in 1401. Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi both submitted designs, relief sculptures depicting the sacrifice of Isaac, and this competition captures something essential about the early Renaissance, the way cities invested in public beauty, the way artists competed for commissions, the way technical skill and classical learning were becoming valued, celebrated, rewarded. Ghiberti won and would spend decades creating bronze doors that Michelangelo would later call worthy of being the gates of paradise, doors where figures emerge from the metal with startling realism, where perspective creates the illusion of deep space, where biblical stories unfold with dramatic power and human emotion. Donatello, Ghiberti's contemporary, pushed sculpture toward even greater naturalism. His bronze David, created sometime in the 1430s or 40s, was the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity, a figure that could be viewed from all sides, that celebrated the beauty of the human body without shame or apology, that drew directly on classical models while remaining entirely Christian in subject. This is the delicate balance that early Renaissance artists had to maintain. They were recovering pagan forms, celebrating human beauty and classical ideals, but they were doing so in a Christian society for Christian patrons, creating works for churches and chapels. So they had to demonstrate that these new techniques, this new vision, served sacred purposes, revealed divine truth through the representation of earthly beauty. In 1437, Fra Angelico began painting frescoes in the monastery of San Marco in Florence, cells where monks would pray and contemplate, and his paintings show this fusion perfectly. They use perspective and naturalism. They show figures with volume and weight, but they remain deeply spiritual, meditative, designed to focus the mind on holy mysteries. The early Renaissance was not a sudden break with the past. It was a gradual shift, a slow accumulation of techniques and ideas, of recovered texts and new observations, of wealth that could be channeled into art, of cities that took pride in beauty and learning, of individuals who dared to look closely at the world, at the body, at ancient ruins and forgotten manuscripts, and who found there something worth preserving, worth studying, worth making new. By the middle of the 15th century, the foundations had been laid, the tools had been developed, the intellectual framework had been established, and what would come next would be even more extraordinary, a flowering of genius so concentrated, so brilliant, that its light would illuminate centuries to come. But it all began here, with Petrarch climbing a mountain, with Giotto painting human faces, with Byzantine scholars carrying manuscripts westward, with merchants who valued beauty, with cities that competed in magnificence, with artists who looked at the world and decided to capture what they saw with unprecedented precision and care. The city hums with a particular energy now as the 15th century reaches its midpoint and then pushes forward into its second half. Florence has become something unprecedented, a crucible where genius seems to concentrate, where workshops produce masterpieces with startling regularity, where the children of craftsmen grow up to reshape how humanity sees itself. In these workshops, the process of becoming an artist follows ancient patterns of apprenticeship. A boy, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, enters the bottega of a master, and he begins with the humblest tasks: grinding pigments, preparing panels, mixing plaster for frescoes, learning through observation and repetition, absorbing not just techniques but ways of seeing. The master's studio is a place of constant activity, assistants working on different sections of a large commission, apprentices copying drawings, the master himself moving between projects, refining a face here, adjusting a composition there and everywhere, the understanding that art is work, skilled labor requiring years of practice, mathematical knowledge, understanding of materials and their properties. Pigments arrive from across the known world. Ultramarine blue made from lapis lazuli, brought from Afghanistan, so precious it costs more than gold, reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary. Crimson from crushed insects, earth tones from ochre and umber, white from lead, black from charcoal, each color requiring specific binding mediums, specific preparation, each with its own temperament and possibilities. The apprentice learns to draw endlessly, obsessively, sketching from life, copying the master's works, studying anatomy through observation of bodies in the street, at the market, in the public baths, developing the hand-eye coordination necessary to capture form, to suggest volume through line, to create the illusion of 3 dimensions on a flat surface. Leonardo da Vinci enters Verrocchio's workshop in the early 1460s, a boy from Vinci, illegitimate son of a notary, showing such promise that his father brings him to Florence, and in that workshop, surrounded by bronze casters and painters and goldsmiths, Leonardo absorbs everything, learns painting and sculpture, mathematics and engineering, develops the insatiable curiosity that will define his life, the conviction that art and science are not separate disciplines, but different approaches to understanding the same reality. He fills notebooks with observations, drawings of water flowing, studies of birdwings in flight, anatomical sketches of extraordinary precision, designs for machines that will not be built for centuries, and his mind moves restlessly from one subject to another: painting, mathematics, geology, anatomy, botany, never satisfied, always probing deeper, seeking the principles underlying appearances. In 1472, Leonardo is accepted into the Painters' Guild, a master in his own right, but he continues working in Verrocchio's shop, and there is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but revealing nonetheless, that when Leonardo painted an angel in Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ, the master was so struck by the quality of his student's work, so humbled by the superiority of that single figure, that he vowed never to paint again. Whether true or not, the story captures something essential about this moment, the sense that a new standard was emerging, that these young artists were achieving things their masters had not imagined possible. Sandro Botticelli paints his Birth of Venus in the 1480s, and the painting is startling in its beauty and its boldness, a goddess emerging from the sea on a shell, naked except for her flowing hair, surrounded by winds and seasons rendered with lyrical grace. It is mythology made visible, pagan subject matter treated with reverence and sophistication, designed for a private chamber in the Medici villa, evidence of how classical themes had become not just acceptable, but celebrated among the sophisticated elite. The painting's linear grace, its emphasis on flowing contour and decorative beauty, represents one approach to Renaissance art, but there are others, and in the variety of styles and approaches, we see the richness of this moment, the sense that multiple visions could coexist, that there was not one correct way to capture reality, but many possible interpretations. In Rome, the papacy is asserting itself as a patron of unprecedented ambition. Pope Sixtus IV commissions the chapel that will bear his name, the Sistine Chapel, completed in 1481, and he brings the leading painters of Florence to decorate its walls, Botticelli and Ghirlandaio and Perugino, creating scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ, establishing Rome as a rival to Florence in artistic achievement. The political landscape of Italy in this period is fragmented and volatile, a patchwork of city-states and territories, republics and duchies, all competing for power and prestige. Milan under the Sforza family, Venice with its maritime empire, Rome under papal control, Naples in the south, and Florence, nominally a republic but effectively controlled by the Medici, who have mastered the art of wielding power without holding official titles. Lorenzo de' Medici, called the Magnificent, rules Florence from 1469 until his death in 1492, and he embodies the Renaissance ideal, poet and patron, politician and philosopher, a man who writes love sonnets and negotiates treaties, who collects ancient manuscripts and sponsors artists, who understands that cultural achievement is itself a form of political power, that beauty and learning enhance a city's reputation more effectively than armies. Under Lorenzo's patronage, Florence becomes a magnet for talent. Philosophers gather at the Platonic Academy he supports, discussing the relationship between Christian theology and classical philosophy, attempting to synthesize Plato and Christ, to demonstrate that ancient wisdom and revealed religion could illuminate each other. Marsilio Ficino translates Plato's complete works into Latin, making them accessible to scholars across Europe, and his commentaries attempt to show how Platonic ideals of beauty and truth point toward Christian understanding of the divine, how the love of earthly beauty can lead the soul toward love of God, how philosophy and theology are complementary paths to wisdom. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola writes his oration on the dignity of man in 1486, arguing that human beings occupy a unique position in creation, neither purely spiritual like angels, nor purely material like animals, but possessing the freedom to shape themselves, to rise or fall through their own choices, and this idea that humans are self-determining, capable of achieving excellence through will and effort, becomes central to Renaissance thought. But even as Florence flourishes, darker currents are moving beneath the surface. In 1478, the Pazzi conspiracy attempts to overthrow Medici rule. Assassins attack Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during Easter Mass. In the cathedral, Giuliano is killed, Lorenzo barely escapes, and the failed coup leads to brutal reprisals, bodies hanging from windows, conspirators hunted and executed. A reminder that this world of beauty and learning is also a world of violence and intrigue. The political tensions eventually create space for a different kind of voice. Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose sermons denounce the worldliness and luxury of Florentine life, who calls for moral reform, for the burning of vanities, for the rejection of pagan influences, and after Lorenzo's death, Savonarola briefly dominates Florence, and there are bonfires of paintings and books, of mirrors and cosmetics, of anything deemed frivolous or sinful, before he himself is arrested, excommunicated, hanged and burned in 1498. This conflict between religious rigor and classical humanism, between ascetic rejection of the world and celebration of earthly beauty, runs throughout the Renaissance, creating tension but also creative energy, forcing artists and thinkers to justify their work, to demonstrate how beauty serves truth, how the study of nature reveals divine design. Meanwhile, in Milan, Leonardo has entered the service of Ludovico Sforza, offering his skills as engineer and artist, and in the refectory of the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie, he paints the Last Supper, working slowly, experimentally, using an oil tempera mixture on dry plaster instead of traditional fresco technique, seeking greater control, more time to refine and adjust. The painting shows Christ and his disciples at the moment he announces that one of them will betray him, and Leonardo captures not a single frozen instant, but a wave of reaction rippling through the group, shock and denial and questioning, each figure with distinct personality and gesture. The composition organized through perspective lines that converge on Christ's head, drawing the eye inexorably to the calm center of the storm. It is deteriorating even as he paints it, his experimental technique proving unstable. But the power of the composition, the psychological depth, the mastery of space and gesture make it immediately legendary, copied and studied by generations of artists who journey to Milan specifically to see it. In 1499, Leonardo fills a notebook page with calculations, trying to determine the quantity of stone removed in excavating the foundation for the Milan Cathedral, and on the same page he sketches mechanisms, studies shadows, drafts a letter, his mind moving fluidly between mathematics and engineering, art and science, seeing connections everywhere, understanding that the same principles govern the flight of birds and the flow of water, the structure of the human body and the proportions of buildings. He dissects corpses, dozens of them, making anatomical drawings of breathtaking precision and beauty, mapping muscles and blood vessels, studying the mechanism of the heart, the structure of the eye, seeking to understand how bodies work, how vision occurs, how life maintains itself. And he does this not just from scientific curiosity, but because he believes that to paint the body convincingly, one must understand its interior architecture, must know what lies beneath the skin. At the turn of the century, as the 1400s become the 1500s, the center of artistic gravity begins shifting toward Rome. A new pope, Julius II, has ambitions to make Rome the greatest city in Christendom, to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, to fill the Vatican with art that will proclaim the power and glory of the Church. He summons Michelangelo Buonarroti, who has already established his reputation with the Pietà in St. Peter's, a sculpture of the dead Christ in Mary's lap, carved when Michelangelo was barely into his 20s, showing technical virtuosity that seems almost superhuman, the way he renders flesh in marble, the way he drapes fabric, the way he captures both grief and acceptance in Mary's face. Julius wants Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but Michelangelo considers himself primarily a sculptor, resists the commission, tries to refuse, but the Pope is not a man who accepts refusal, and so Michelangelo designs scaffolding, mixes his plasters, and begins the work that will consume 4 years of his life, lying on his back on the scaffolding, paint dripping into his eyes, working by candlelight. He covers over 10,000 square feet of ceiling with scenes from Genesis, the creation of Adam, the fall of man, the flood, and surrounding these central narratives, prophets and sibyls, figures of such power and scale that they seem to burst from their painted frames, nudes of extraordinary beauty and anatomical precision, the whole ceiling organized into a complex architectural framework that uses the actual curve of the vault, that creates the illusion of structure while remaining entirely painted. The moment when God's finger reaches toward Adam's, both hands extended in that tiny gap that separates divine and human, has become one of the most recognized images in Western art. But it is just one detail in a vast theological program, a meditation on creation and fall, on prophecy and salvation, on the relationship between God and humanity. Michelangelo works with minimal assistance, dismissing the helpers the Pope provides, doing most of the painting himself, driven by a vision of perfection, by the belief that the image exists already in his mind, needs only to be revealed, and the physical toll is enormous. But when it is finished in 1512, it establishes a standard that will define high Renaissance art, a synthesis of classical beauty and Christian narrative, of anatomical knowledge and spiritual meaning, of technical mastery and visionary imagination. The years that follow become a cascade of masterpieces, as though some dam has broken and genius flows freely through Italian cities, Rome and Florence and Venice, all producing works that will define Western art for centuries, and the artists themselves become celebrities, their lives document, their personalities debated, their works commanding prices that make them wealthy men. Raphael Sanzio arrives in Rome in 1508, called by Pope Julius II to decorate the Vatican apartments, and though he is younger than Michelangelo and Leonardo, though he has studied their works and absorbed their lessons, he brings his own gifts, a grace and harmony that seems effortless, a sweetness of expression that never becomes saccharine, a mastery of composition that makes even complex scenes appear natural and inevitable. In the Stanza della Segnatura, one of the papal chambers, Raphael paints the School of Athens, a fresco showing the great philosophers of antiquity gathered in a magnificent architectural space. Plato and Aristotle at the center, one pointing upward toward ideal forms, the other gesturing toward the earth and empirical observation, and surrounding them, Pythagoras and Euclid, Heraclitus and Diogenes, each figure individualized, each engaged in debate or contemplation or teaching. It is a vision of intellectual community, of wisdom as collective endeavor, and it demonstrates how completely classical philosophy has been integrated into Christian culture. These pagan thinkers painted on the wall of the Pope's private library, celebrated as seekers of truth, whose insights complement rather than contradict revealed religion. Raphael reportedly uses his contemporaries as models, painting Michelangelo's face onto Heraclitus, Leonardo's features onto Plato, even including his own portrait among the figures on the right, and this collapsing of past and present, this suggestion that Renaissance thinkers are the legitimate heirs of ancient philosophers, captures something essential about how this period understood itself. In Venice, a different aesthetic is developing, one less concerned with linear precision and sculptural form, more interested in color and atmosphere, in the play of light on surfaces, in the sensuous beauty of paint itself. Titian, who will dominate Venetian painting for most of the 16th century, uses color with unprecedented boldness, building up layers of pigment, allowing earlier layers to show through, creating surfaces that seem to glow from within. His paintings of mythological subjects, of Venus and Diana and Bacchus, celebrate physical beauty without apology, the human body rendered with such loving attention that the paintings themselves become objects of desire. Venice is different from Florence and Rome, a maritime republic whose wealth comes from trade with the East, whose architecture reflects Byzantine influence, whose climate is humid, softening colors, making everything shimmer and blur at the edges. And Venetian painting develops qualities that match the city itself, a love of luxury and spectacle, rich fabrics and jewels, scenes of pageantry and celebration. Giovanni Bellini, Titian's teacher, paints altarpieces where sacred figures are set in landscapes of extraordinary beauty, where the natural world becomes a meditation on divine creation, where light itself seems holy, and this integration of religious subject matter with careful observation of nature. This sense that the visible world reveals spiritual truth runs throughout Renaissance art, justifying the attention to material beauty, the study of light and color and form. But as the 16th century progresses, as the High Renaissance reaches its peak, new tensions begin to emerge. The Protestant Reformation explodes across Northern Europe, challenging papal authority, questioning the very foundations of the Church, and the unity of Christendom fractures irreparably. Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses in 1517, arguing against indulgences, against the corruption he sees in the church hierarchy, and his words, printed and distributed, translated and debated, spread with unprecedented speed. The printing press, perfected by Gutenberg in the mid-1400s, has transformed the circulation of ideas, made it impossible to contain dissent, to control what people read and think. The Reformation creates a crisis for Renaissance humanism. Many humanists had criticized church corruption, had called for reform, had emphasized individual conscience and direct engagement with Scripture, but most had not intended schism, had hoped for renewal within the church, and now they must choose sides or attempt the increasingly difficult task of remaining neutral in a polarizing conflict. In 1527, the unthinkable happens. Imperial troops, many of them Lutheran mercenaries, sack Rome, killing, looting, desecrating churches, holding the Pope prisoner, and the catastrophe sends shockwaves through Italy, shatters the sense that Rome is inviolable, that the Church can protect those under its authority, that the Renaissance project of cultural renewal will continue undisturbed. Artists and intellectuals scatter, seeking new patrons, new cities, new certainties in a world that suddenly seems unstable, and the art that follows begins to show strain, a restlessness, a movement away from the balanced harmonies of the High Renaissance towards something more turbulent and expressive. Michelangelo returns to the Sistine Chapel in 1536, now an old man, painting the Last Judgment on the altar wall, and it is a vision of apocalypse, of bodies rising and falling, of the saved and the damned sorted by divine judgment, Christ as muscular judge rather than suffering Savior. The whole composition a writhing mass of humanity facing ultimate reckoning, and the mood is darker, more anxious, reflecting perhaps the uncertainties of the age, the sense that the stable world of the early Renaissance has given way to something more chaotic and dangerous. The Church responds to Protestant challenge with the Counter-Reformation, with the Council of Trent beginning in 1545, reforming abuses but also enforcing orthodoxy, tightening control over what can be painted and written, insisting that art serve clear didactic purposes, that it inspire devotion rather than aesthetic pleasure, that it avoid anything that might seem frivolous or sensual. Some works are censored, deemed too provocative, too pagan in their celebration of physical beauty. Michelangelo's nudes in the Sistine Chapel are painted over with drapery, modest loincloths added to cover what had been celebrated as divine craftsmanship, and artists must navigate these new restrictions, must justify their work in explicitly religious terms, must demonstrate that beauty serves faith rather than competing with it. Yet the techniques and insights of the Renaissance spread northward. Albrecht Dürer travels to Italy, absorbs lessons of proportion and perspective, brings them back to Germany, his prince disseminating Italian innovations across Europe. His theoretical writings explaining the mathematics underlying Renaissance art, making the knowledge available to any artist who can read. In France, King Francis I invites Leonardo to his court, the aging master spending his final years in the Loire Valley, bringing with him the Mona Lisa, that portrait of a Florentine merchant's wife that has become perhaps the most famous painting in the world. Her enigmatic expression, her hands folded calmly, the mysterious landscape behind her, all rendered with sfumato, that technique of subtle gradations, of edges that blur and soften, creating an impression of life and breath, of a consciousness behind the eyes. Leonardo dies in 1519, leaving notebooks filled with observations and inventions, treatises on painting and anatomy, studies of mechanics and hydraulics, a mind that ranged across all knowledge, seeking the fundamental principles, the underlying order. And though many of his projects remained unfinished, though he completed relatively few paintings, his influence permeates the Renaissance, his conviction that art and science are united, that observation leads to understanding, that the patient study of nature reveals truth. The Italian Renaissance begins to shade into something else, into mannerism, into Baroque, the clarity and balance of the High Renaissance giving way to more complex compositions, more emotional intensity, more dramatic uses of light and shadow, artists like Pontormo and Bronzino creating works of sophisticated artifice, elongated figures, unusual colors, compositions that call attention to their own cleverness, their departure from natural appearance, but the Renaissance spirit, the commitment to human dignity and potential, the recovery of classical learning, the development of techniques for representing three-dimensional space, the integration of observation and theory, all of this becomes the foundation for European culture, shapes how artists will work for centuries, establishes standards and aspirations that remain influential even now. In 1564, Michelangelo dies in Rome, having lived through almost the entire arc of the High Renaissance and its aftermath, having known Leonardo and Raphael, having worked for popes and princes, having transformed sculpture and painting and architecture, leaving behind works of such power that they continue to move viewers, to inspire awe, to demonstrate what human hands and human vision can achieve. The workshops continue. The techniques pass from master to apprentice, but something has shifted. The concentration of genius that characterized Florence and Rome in those decades around 1500 proves impossible to sustain, impossible to replicate. And gradually, the Renaissance becomes history rather than living present, becomes something to study and honor rather than something to participate in and extend. Yet its legacy spreads across Europe, shapes the Northern Renaissance in the Netherlands and Germany, influences the development of art and thought in France and England and Spain, the humanist emphasis on education, on the study of classical texts, on the dignity and potential of human beings becomes part of how Europe understands itself, how it educates its young, how it justifies its intellectual and artistic endeavors. The universities incorporate humanist curricula, teaching rhetoric and moral philosophy alongside theology. The printing press makes books affordable, makes classical text available to anyone who can read, and literacy spreads, slowly but inexorably, changing how knowledge circulates, how ideas develop and evolve. The Renaissance becomes a reference point, a standard of excellence, and later ages will look back to it, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with critique, recognizing both its achievements and its limitations, its celebration of human potential and its frequent exclusion of those deemed less than fully human, its recovery of classical wisdom and its sometimes uncritical acceptance of classical hierarchies. But in those workshops and studios, in those libraries and academies, in those churches and palaces where artists and thinkers pursued their visions with such intensity and devotion, something remarkable happened, a transformation in how humanity understood itself, a flowering of creativity that demonstrated what becomes possible when wealth and learning, technique and vision, curiosity and discipline all align, even briefly, even imperfectly, creating beauty that endures across centuries, asking questions that each generation must answer anew. There is something worth contemplating in the Renaissance understanding of imitation, the idea that seemed paradoxical to later ages, that originality could emerge from copying, that one learned to see by reproducing what others had seen, that apprentices spent years drawing the same hands, the same drapery folds, the same classical statues, until their hands knew the form so completely that invention became possible. This is different from how modern culture often thinks about creativity. The romantic notion of the isolated genius producing ex nihilo, from nothing, the artist who rejects all influence and creates purely from internal vision. But Renaissance artists understood that mastery required submission, that freedom came through discipline, that you earned the right to innovate by first proving you could replicate. Leonardo's notebooks show this clearly. Pages filled with studies of hands in every possible position, sketches of water flowing over obstacles, observations of how fabric behaves when draped over a sphere. He is teaching himself to see, training his hand to capture what his eye perceives, building a vocabulary of forms that he can later deploy, combine, transform into something unprecedented. And there is humility in this approach. the recognition that the artist stands in a tradition, that countless others have confronted these same problems, that wisdom accumulates across generations, that even genius builds on what came before. The Renaissance recovered this from classical culture. The idea of building on foundations laid by predecessors, of engaging in dialogue with the past, and in doing so, it created something that felt both ancient and entirely new, a synthesis that honored tradition while pushing beyond it. Consider how they thought about perspective, not merely as a trick for creating illusion, but as a window onto truth, a way of organizing reality according to mathematical principles, of demonstrating that the visible world operates according to discoverable laws, that human perception itself can be understood, quantified, replicated. When Brunelleschi demonstrated linear perspective, when he showed that parallel lines appear to converge at a vanishing point, when he proved that there are rules governing how objects diminish with distance, he was doing more than solving an artistic problem. He was asserting that reality is knowable, that human reason can penetrate appearances and grasp underlying structure. This conviction that observation and mathematics could reveal truth would eventually lead to modern science, to Galileo studying motion and Kepler mapping planetary orbits, to Newton formulating the laws of universal gravitation, the Renaissance belief in human capacity to understand the world through careful study and logical reasoning opened doors that would never fully close again. But there was always this dual nature to Renaissance thought, this coexistence of sacred and secular, of Christian devotion and pagan celebration, of ascetic discipline and sensuous pleasure. And the tension between these poles generated creative energy, forced artists and thinkers to justify their work, to explain how beauty serves truth, how the study of nature reveals divine design. Michelangelo could spend years carving David, celebrating the perfection of the male nude, the potential power contained in a young body, and he could do this for a Christian city, for placement outside a church, because the statue could be understood as showing divine creation, humanity made in God's image, the biblical hero as embodiment of civic virtue and holy purpose. The same artist could paint the Sistine ceiling, filling it with nudes of astonishing beauty, athletes and ancestors, sibyls and prophets, all rendered with such attention to anatomy, to the play of muscles beneath skin, to the beauty of physical form. And this too could be sacred art, because the body was understood as divine handiwork, as proof of God's creative power, as worthy of study and celebration precisely because it revealed the infinite skill of its maker. This integration, this refusal to separate body and soul, matter and spirit, earthly beauty and heavenly truth, characterizes Renaissance humanism at its best. The conviction that all aspects of human experience, all forms of knowledge, all expressions of creativity could be brought into relationship, could illuminate each other, could serve both temporal and eternal purposes. And there is something deeply appealing in this vision, this refusal of false dichotomies, this embrace of complexity and nuance. Even as we recognize that the reality often fell short of the ideal, that the people of the Renaissance were as flawed and conflicted as any other generation, that their society had hierarchies and exclusions we now find troubling. Still, the aspiration itself, the vision of integrated knowledge and holistic culture, remains compelling. The workshops where apprentices learned their craft were also schools of philosophy, places where young people absorbed not just techniques, but values, ways of thinking about quality and excellence, about the relationship between effort and achievement, about the dignity of skilled work, about the possibility of creating beauty that would outlast its makers. And perhaps this is part of why Renaissance art continues to move us, why tourists still crowd into the Uffizi and the Vatican, why reproductions of these paintings hang in homes around the world, why we still use these works to think about what it means to be human, because they embody this vision of human potential, this belief that through discipline and vision, through careful observation and technical mastery, through devotion to craft and openness to beauty, individuals can create things of lasting value, can participate in something larger than themselves, can leave behind evidence of what humans, fallible and mortal as we are, can nevertheless achieve. The Renaissance reminds us that culture is made, that it requires patronage and support, that it emerges from specific material conditions, wealthy cities and trade routes, social structures that create space for learning and art, individuals willing to dedicate resources to beauty rather than only to utility or defense. It shows us that transformation happens through accumulation, through many people making small advances, sharing techniques, building on each other's discoveries. That genius emerges from communities, from workshops and academies, from conversations and competitions, from the fertile chaos of cities where different traditions meet and mingle, and it demonstrates that what we call progress is neither inevitable nor linear, that capabilities can be lost as well as gained, that the techniques Giotto developed were forgotten for centuries before being recovered. That knowledge must be actively preserved, taught, passed forward, or it vanishes like smoke. Standing now in imagination before these works, before the David or the School of Athens or the Birth of Venus, I feel the accumulated weight of centuries, the countless viewers who have stood in these same spots, who have lifted their eyes toward painted ceilings or gazed at marble bodies, who have felt themselves in the presence of something that exceeds ordinary experience. The paint has faded, the marble has weathered. Restoration work continues endlessly, fighting against time and pollution and the simple entropy that breaks down all human creations, and yet they persist. These works that emerge from workshops in Florence and Rome, from the minds and hands of individuals whose names we know, whose faces we can see in self-portraits, whose struggles and triumphs are documented in contracts and letters and the memories of contemporaries. They lived in a different world, one without electricity or engines, without photography or digital reproduction, a world where images were rare and precious, where seeing a painting meant traveling to where it hung, where the experience of art was always embedded in physical space, in specific light and architecture, in the ritual of pilgrimage and presence. We have lost that scarcity, that sense of art as rare encounter. We can call up these images on screens, can zoom into details the original viewers could never see, can compare works from different cities and decades with effortless ease, and something is gained in this accessibility, this democratization of beauty, but something is also lost. The awe of encountering these works in their intended contexts, the way the Last Judgment fills the entire altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. The way the dome of Florence Cathedral dominates the city skyline, the way these works were meant to be experienced as part of life, not isolated in museums, but integrated into churches and palaces, into the fabric of daily existence. The Renaissance becomes for us a kind of touchstone, a moment we return to when thinking about human possibility, about what civilization can achieve when conditions align, when wealth and talent, patronage and vision all converge, and perhaps we idealize it, perhaps we project onto it qualities it never fully possessed. Perhaps we forget the violence and inequality that coexisted with the beauty, the wars and conspiracies, the exclusions and hierarchies. But even acknowledging these complications, these shadows, there remains something worth honoring in what was accomplished, in the recovery of learning, in the development of techniques that allowed artists to capture human emotion and physical form with unprecedented precision, in the vision of human dignity and potential, in the belief that through education and effort, through discipline and creativity, individuals could elevate themselves, could participate in the creation of beauty and the pursuit of truth. The light is fading now in this imagined journey, the workshops falling quiet as evening comes to Florence, to Rome, to Venice, the apprentices putting away their brushes and pigments, the masters stepping back from their work, satisfied or frustrated, planning tomorrow's efforts, and in the churches and palaces, the frescoes and altarpieces settle into shadows, waiting for dawn to reveal them again, to bring visitors who will stand before them, who will look up at painted ceilings or carved marble and feel, if only for a moment, lifted beyond themselves, connected to something larger, to the accumulated striving and achievement of generations, to the evidence that humans can create beauty that endures. And this is what the Renaissance offers us still, not just the works themselves, though they remain astonishing, but the example, the demonstration that transformation is possible, that cultures can renew themselves through engagement with the past, that beauty and learning matter, that individuals with vision and skill can shape how entire civilizations see themselves, can create works that speak across centuries, that continue to move and inspire and challenge long after their makers have returned to dust. The story does not truly end. The Renaissance flows into Baroque and Neoclassicism, into Romanticism and Modernism, into every subsequent artistic movement that has had to define itself in relation to this moment, that has had to decide what to keep and what to reject, what to honor and what to transform. And the conversation continues, quiet as evening, persistent as light, returning each dawn, reminding us of what humans have made and what we might yet make if we have the vision to see, the courage to attempt, the discipline to persist in pursuit of beauty, in service of truth, in celebration of all we are and might become. There is something almost sacred about the oldest objects we keep, the ones that survive not because they are precious metals or jewels, but because they were made for joy, for wonder, for the simple pleasure of a child's hands. Toys have traveled with us through every age, from the earliest moments of human civilization to this very evening, and in their quiet persistence, in their presence across millennia, they tell us something profound about what it means to be human, about imagination, about the way we learn to understand the world through play. I find myself thinking tonight about all the children who have ever lived, about the universal impulse to create something small and manageable, something that fits in young hands, something that moves or rolls or transforms, and how that impulse crosses every boundary we might imagine, every culture, every century, every corner of the earth. The story of toys is not merely a catalogue of objects, it is a chronicle of human creativity at its most tender, most hopeful, because when we make toys, we are not building monuments or weapons or tools of survival. We are building doorways into wonder. We are saying that childhood matters, that imagination deserves materials, that play itself is worth preserving. And so tonight I find myself wandering through this long and gentle history, through archaeological sites and ancient cities, through medieval workshops and industrial factories, through the hands of craftspeople and the hearts of parents, all of them connected by this single thread, the desire to give children something beautiful to hold. The earliest toys we know of are so old that they predate writing itself. They come from times when human civilization was still finding its footing, still learning to plant crops and build permanent homes, and yet already there were small carved animals, small wheeled carts, small dolls with movable limbs. Already there was this understanding that children needed more than food and shelter. They needed objects that sparked something in the mind. Archaeologists have found these ancient playthings in the ruins of cities that vanished thousands of years ago, in the tombs of Egypt and the settlements of Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley and along the Yellow River. And what strikes me most powerfully is how recognizable they are, how a wooden horse carved 4,000 years ago would still be understood instantly by a child today, how the imagination works in patterns that time cannot erase. There is something deeply moving about holding the idea of these objects in mind, about imagining a child in ancient Thebes, in Ur, in Mohenjo-Daro, reaching for a toy that their parent had carved or sewn or shaped from clay. The same reaching motion that children make now, the same delight in something made just for them. The materials were simple, wood and clay and bone and fabric, whatever the earth offered and human hands could shape, but the intentions were sophisticated. Already these ancient toy makers understood proportion and balance, understood that a doll should have a face to speak to, that a cart should have wheels that actually turn, that a ball should be round enough to roll true. And as I let my mind wander through these early centuries, I notice how toys became part of ritual, part of ceremony, how they were sometimes placed in tombs to accompany children into whatever came next, how they were offerings to gods, how they marked the boundary between childhood and adulthood in cultures that celebrated that transition with gift-giving and symbolic objects. But mostly they were simply there, in homes and courtyards and market squares, being pulled along dusty streets, being clutched during long journeys, being passed from older siblings to younger ones, being mended when they broke because they mattered, because a beloved toy was not disposable. It was a companion. I think about the universality of certain forms. The doll appears everywhere humans have lived, in every material imaginable, because children everywhere have needed something to nurture, something to project their understanding of human relationships onto. Dolls were mothers and babies and friends and strangers. They were as complex as the children who played with them, and animals, carved animals, clay animals, animals on wheels or animals that could be pulled on strings, because children live so close to the animal world, because understanding animals meant understanding survival and danger and companionship, and because animals in miniature were somehow more approachable, more knowable than the living creatures that towered over small bodies. The ancient world was full of noise and labor and uncertainty, and yet within that world there was space carved out for these small objects, space in the household economy, space in the artisan's workshop, space in the child's day for play, for imagination, for the kind of learning that happens when a mind is free to explore. And so the story begins here, in these earliest moments, when humanity first decided that childhood deserved its own objects, its own beauty, its own dedicated space in the material world, when the first toy maker, whose name we will never know, carved or shaped or stitched something and placed it in a child's hands and watched what happened next. The ancient Greeks and Romans carried this tradition forward, expanding it, refining it, turning toy making into something closer to a craft. And in the markets of Athens and the streets of Rome, there were vendors who sold nothing but playthings, small workshops dedicated entirely to the production of objects meant for children's hands. In Greece, where philosophy and mathematics flourished, where the human mind was celebrated as something worth cultivating, toys became more sophisticated, more thoughtfully designed. There were yo-yos made of terracotta, perfectly weighted clay discs connected by cord, and the physics of their motion, the way they spun and returned, was already understood, already being engineered into objects meant for play. There were articulated dolls with jointed limbs, tiny bronze and clay figures whose arms and legs could be moved into different positions, positioned into tableaux, into stories. And I find myself imagining the child who first discovered that these limbs could bend, who understood suddenly that this small figure could dance, could fight, could embrace another doll, could become anything the imagination required. The wealthy families of Rome commissioned elaborate doll houses, miniature furniture carved from ivory and precious woods, tiny bronze cooking vessels, little oil lamps that actually worked, entire domestic worlds recreated in scale. And these were not crude approximations. They were precise reproductions. They taught children about the adult world they would inherit, about household management and social hierarchy, about the objects that defined civilized life. But toys were not only for the wealthy. Even in the poorest households, there were simple balls made of rags stitched together, wooden tops that could be spun with string, dolls fashioned from corn husks or scraps of fabric, because the impulse to give children something to play with transcended economic class. It was fundamental. It was universal. Roman children played with wooden swords, with hobby horses, with small carts pulled by mice or birds trained for the purpose. And in the archaeological record we find gaming pieces, knucklebones used for games of chance, marbles made of clay or stone or glass, evidence of play that was social, competitive, rule-bound. The Roman writer Horace mentioned toys in his poetry, described gold and silver toys as examples of wealthy excess, but also acknowledged that all children, regardless of station, engaged in similar forms of play, built similar structures from whatever materials they could find, and acted similar dramas with whatever figures they possessed. And as the Roman Empire spread across Europe and the Mediterranean, toys traveled with it. Designs were shared. Techniques were exchanged. A doll style from Egypt might influence a craftsman in Gaul. A ball-making method from Greece might appear in Britain. Toys became part of the complex web of cultural transmission that empires create. When Rome fell, when the ancient world gave way to medieval Europe, toys did not disappear. They changed. They adapted to new economic realities, to new social structures, to new materials and new markets. In medieval Europe, childhood itself was understood differently. Children were seen as small adults, expected to contribute to household labor from an early age. And yet there were still toys, still objects made specifically for play, still evidence that even in harsh times, even in periods of great uncertainty, the impulse to nurture childhood remained. Medieval toys were often simple: wooden dolls with painted faces, small carved animals, leather balls stuffed with hair or wool. But they were lovingly made, carefully preserved, sometimes even mentioned in wills and estate inventories, which tells us they had value, emotional, if not monetary, that they were considered worth passing down. The medieval period gave us hobby horses, those simple stick horses that children could ride, galloping through castle courtyards or village squares, imitating the knights and nobles they saw around them. And the hobby horse endured for centuries, adapted across cultures, remained a staple of childhood play because it offered transformation. It turned a child into a rider, into someone powerful and mobile. Craftsmen's guilds began to form, and among them were guilds of toy makers, specialized artisans who dedicated their skills to creating playthings. In Nuremberg, in particular, toy making became a serious trade, a recognized profession, and the city became famous throughout Europe for the quality and variety of its toys. Nuremberg toy makers worked in wood and tin and pewter. They created elaborate Noah's Arks filled with pairs of carved animals. They made miniature kitchens with functional doors and drawers. They produced soldiers and knights cast in metal, painted with careful detail, and these toys were exported across Europe, carried by merchants to markets in distant cities. The Noah's Ark became especially significant because it was a toy that religious families could justify. It taught biblical stories. It familiarized children with Scripture. And yet, it was also simply delightful. A boat filled with animals, a world in miniature, a story that could be enacted and reenacted endlessly. In Asia, meanwhile, toy traditions were developing along different lines, following different aesthetic principles, employing different materials and techniques, creating objects that reflected different cultural values and different understandings of childhood. In China, kites had been flown for centuries, not only as toys, but as tools of warfare and communication. But in children's hands they became pure play, became experiments in wind and balance, became dragons and birds dancing in the sky, and the craft of kite-making became sophisticated, involving paper and silk and bamboo, requiring understanding of aerodynamics, even if that knowledge was intuitive rather than scientific. Chinese children played with diabolos, those hourglass-shaped spinning toys manipulated on a string, requiring skill and practice and coordination, and with shadow puppets, intricate figures cut from leather or paper, whose stories were projected onto screens, whose movements taught narrative, taught cause and effect, taught the power of performance. In Japan, Toys were often connected to festivals, to seasonal celebrations. There were battledores and shuttlecocks for the new year, Daruma dolls that represented perseverance and good fortune, Kokeshi dolls with their simple, limbless bodies and oversized heads, each region developing its own style, its own painting techniques, its own symbolic meanings. Japanese toy makers understood negative space, understood simplicity as a form of sophistication. Their toys were often minimal in detail, but maximum in suggestion, allowing the child's imagination to complete what the object implied. And this aesthetic, this restraint, created toys that were both beautiful objects and open invitations to creative play. In India, toys were made from clay and papier-mâché and wood. There were elaborate temple toys, toys that moved when strings were pulled, toys that demonstrated mechanical principles. There were small kitchens and cooking sets because cooking was sacred, was ritualistic, was worth reproducing in miniature for children to explore. And across the Islamic world, from Spain to Persia to North Africa, there were toys that reflected the mathematical and artistic sophistication of Islamic culture. Geometric puzzles, intricate carved wooden balls within balls, toys that taught pattern and proportion, that embedded learning within play. What strikes me as I move through these centuries, through these different cultures, is how seriously adults took the work of making toys, how much skill was invested, how much thought. These were not afterthoughts or crude approximations. They were crafted objects. They represented the best work that artisans could offer, and the materials mattered. Wood had to be chosen carefully, had to be carved with attention to grain and strength. Clay had to be properly fired. Paint had to be non-toxic and durable, because these objects would be handled roughly, would be chewed on and dropped and dragged through dirt. They had to withstand the enthusiasm of childhood. By the Renaissance, as wealth increased, as trade routes expanded, as cities grew and merchant classes emerged, toys became more elaborate, more diverse, more widely available. The aristocratic families of Europe filled their nurseries with mechanical marvels, with automata that could move and make sounds, with expensive imported dolls dressed in the latest fashions. But even as luxury toys proliferated, even as some toys became status symbols, demonstrations of wealth and sophistication, the fundamental forms persisted. Children still played with balls and dolls and animals, still built towers from wooden blocks, still enacted the same basic narratives of family and adventure and transformation. The printing press, invented in the mid-1500s, eventually gave rise to printed paper toys, to books designed specifically for children, to paper dolls and paper theaters that could be cut out and assembled. And this democratized toys in a new way, made them reproducible, made them affordable for families who could never commission carved wooden toys from master craftsmen. And throughout all of this, throughout all these centuries and cultures and innovations, children were doing what children have always done. They were playing. They were learning through manipulation and experimentation. They were creating worlds within worlds. They were practicing being human, and the toys were their tools, their props, their companions in that essential work. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the rise of educational toys as Enlightenment thinking emphasized reason and learning, as childhood began to be understood as a distinct phase of life that deserved protection and cultivation. Toys were designed to teach geography, to teach letters and numbers, to teach moral lessons through play. Puzzle maps appeared, wooden jigsaws that taught the shapes of countries and continents, alphabet blocks with letters carved or printed on their sides, toys that had explicit pedagogical purposes, but were still fundamentally toys, still objects of delight and manipulation, and dolls became more realistic, more detailed. Doll makers in France and Germany created porcelain-headed dolls with glass eyes and real hair, dolls that could be dressed and undressed, that came with wardrobes and accessories, that allowed children to practice the social rituals they observed in adult life. The Industrial Revolution was approaching, waiting just ahead in the timeline, ready to transform everything about how toys were made and distributed and understood. But before that transformation, there was this long period, these thousands of years, when toys were handmade, when each one was unique, when toy making was a craft passed down through generations of artisans who understood wood and clay and fabric, who understood children, who understood play, and then the machines came, and everything changed. Not all at once, not overnight, but gradually, relentlessly, as the Industrial Revolution spread across Europe and America, as factories rose and production methods transformed, as the handmade gave way to the manufactured. The first toy factories appeared in Germany in the early 1800s. In the Thuringian forest region, where families had been carving wooden toys for generations, and these families began to organize their work differently, to specialize, to create assembly lines where one person carved heads, another carved bodies, another painted faces, and suddenly production increased tenfold, 20-fold. Nuremberg remained at the center of this transformation, its toy makers embracing new materials, new techniques. Tin became a favored medium because it could be stamped and cut and soldered, because it could be painted with bright enamels, because it was cheaper than wood and lighter than cast metal. The tin toy, with its characteristic sound, that hollow rattle when shaken, became the sound of 19th century childhood. Tin soldiers marching in formation, tin carriages with turning wheels, tin animals painted in colors that nature never intended, bright reds and blues and yellows that caught the eye, that announced themselves as objects of joy rather than representations of reality. Mechanical toys emerged, wind-up mechanisms adapted from clockwork, toys that could move on their own, that could walk or hop or spin, and the wonder of a toy that moved without being pushed, that contained its own energy, its own animation, was profound. It was almost magical. It suggested life where there was only spring and gears. French toy makers became famous for their automata, for mechanical dolls that could write or draw or play music. These were expensive, often too expensive for children to actually play with. They became drawing room curiosities, demonstrations of mechanical ingenuity, but they inspired simpler versions, wind-up toys that children could afford, that could perform simple repetitive motions, a bear that drummed, a bird that pecked, and as factories grew, as production scaled, toys became more affordable, more accessible. Middle-class families could now fill their nurseries with variety, could buy new toys for birthdays and holidays, could replace broken toys rather than mending them. And this shift, this abundance, changed the relationship between children and their playthings. The Victorian era, with its particular attitudes toward childhood, its emphasis on moral education and proper behavior, produced toys that reflected these values. There were toy theaters that enacted improving stories. There were board games that taught virtues and punished vices. There were dolls and dollhouses that modeled idealized domestic life. But there were also trains, those glorious miniature railways that captured the imagination of the age. Because trains were the future. Trains were power and speed and connection. Trains were transforming the world, and in miniature they became accessible, became controllable, became something a child could master. The first toy trains were simple push toys, wooden or tin locomotives that rolled on wheels, but soon there were clockwork trains, then steam-powered trains that actually ran on real steam, tiny boilers heated by real flames, dangerous and thrilling and absolutely captivating, and eventually electric trains running on metal tracks, controlled by switches and signals, entire miniature worlds of rail transport. Germany dominated toy train production through the late 1800s. Companies like Marklin created trains of extraordinary detail and quality, trains that were scale models of real locomotives, that came with stations and signals and bridges that could be assembled into complex layouts. And these weren't just toys, they were hobbies, they were collections, they were systems that could be expanded year after year. In America, the toy industry was developing its own character, its own innovations. American toy makers embraced cast iron, heavy durable metals that could be molded into intricate shapes. Cast iron banks became popular. Mechanical banks where a coin would trigger an action, a figure would move, a door would open, saving money became a game, became entertainment. American toys were often more robust, built for rough play, built to survive the frontier spirit. There were cast iron fire engines and horse-drawn wagons. There were cap guns and toy rifles. There were building sets made from metal strips and bolts. Early versions of construction toys that taught mechanical principles through assembly. The teddy bear arrived in 1902, simultaneously in America and Germany, inspired by President Theodore Roosevelt's refusal to shoot a captured bear, and the timing was somehow perfect. The world was ready for a soft toy bear, for something cuddly and comforting rather than educational or mechanical. Margaret Steiff in Germany had been making stuffed animals, had developed a jointed bear design, and Morris Mictom in America created his own version, and suddenly every child wanted a bear. The teddy bear became perhaps the most successful toy design in history, enduring across generations, across cultures, becoming so fundamental to childhood that it's hard to imagine a time before them. The early 1900s saw an explosion of innovation, new materials, new manufacturing processes, new understandings of child development and play. Celluloid allowed for lightweight dolls with detailed features. Composition materials created durable doll bodies. Rubber-made balls that bounced higher and toys that were waterproof. Dolls became increasingly sophisticated. They could cry. They could wet themselves. They could close their eyes when laid down, each innovation bringing them closer to real babies, making them better tools for nurturing play, for the practice of caregiving that was considered essential for girls of that era. And the division became more pronounced. Toys for boys, toys for girls, blue and pink, aggressive and nurturing, construction and domesticity. The toy industry began to market specifically to these categories to reinforce gender roles through play, building sets and toy soldiers for boys, dolls and kitchen sets for girls. Meccano appeared in 1901, invented by Frank Hornby in England, a metal construction system with strips and plates and gears and wheels. And it was revolutionary. It wasn't a toy that did something. It was a toy that could become anything. A crane today, a bridge tomorrow, a car next week. It taught engineering principles, taught problem solving, taught the satisfaction of building something complex from simple parts. In Denmark, a carpenter named Ole Kirk Christiansen was beginning to make wooden toys in his workshop, simple pull toys and yo-yos, well-crafted pieces that reflected Scandinavian design principles, clean lines, natural materials, quality construction. He named his company Lego, from the Danish phrase leg god, meaning play well. And though the plastic bricks that would make the company famous were still decades away, the philosophy was already there, the belief that good play required good tools. The years between the two world wars were difficult. Economies struggled, families had less to spend, but toy companies adapted. They made toys cheaper, simpler. They used less metal, more paper and cardboard. They created toys that could be manufactured quickly and sold for pennies rather than dollars. And children played through depression and hardship. Children played because play is not optional. It's not a luxury that disappears when times are hard. It's fundamental. It's how children process the world, how they practice being alive. And so families found ways, made toys from scraps and cast-offs, created playthings from imagination and necessity. The Second World War disrupted everything. Factories that had made toys now made munitions. Metal that would have become toy soldiers became real weapons, and many toy companies shuttered or pivoted entirely to war production. Childhood continued, but childhood's material culture shrank, became more precious, became something to be preserved and protected. But when the war ended, when soldiers returned home and families rebuilt, there was a boom, an explosion of births and optimism and consumption. The baby boom generation arrived, and with them came unprecedented demand for toys, for everything, for newness and abundance and delight. And the toy industry responded. Factories retooled. New companies emerged. Plastics, those miracle materials developed during the war, became the medium of the new era, cheap, colorful, moldable into any shape, durable enough to survive childhood, light enough to be safe. Barbie appeared in 1959, created by Ruth Handler, inspired by her daughter's imaginative play with paper dolls. And Barbie was different. She wasn't a baby doll to nurture. She was an adult figure, a teenage fashion model with an extensive wardrobe, with careers and accessories and eventually friends and family. And she became controversial, became culturally significant, became a mirror reflecting changing attitudes toward femininity and aspiration. Hot Wheels launched in 1968. Tiny die-cast cars designed to race on plastic tracks, cars with low-friction wheels that could achieve remarkable speeds, cars decorated with wild graphics and custom paint jobs, and suddenly boys were collecting, trading, racing, building elaborate track systems, and the simple joy of a fast, small car became an empire. Lego introduced the plastic brick in 1949, but it wasn't until 1958 that they patented the stud and tube coupling system, the design that allowed bricks to clutch together with just the right amount of force, strong enough to build tall structures, gentle enough for small hands to separate. And this was genius. This was a toy system that scaled infinitely, that could be as simple or as complex as the builder desired. The construction toy, in its various forms, represented something profound about mid-century optimism, the belief that the world could be built, that problems could be solved through engineering, that children should learn to create rather than simply consume. And so there were Lincoln Logs and Tinker Toys and Erector sets, all offering different approaches to the same fundamental activity: building, creating, making something from nothing. Action figures arrived in 1964 with G.I. Joe, dolls for boys. Though they were never called dolls, they were action figures, soldiers with articulated joints and military equipment, and they opened a new market, proved that boys would engage in narrative play with figures if those figures represented action and adventure rather than domesticity. Electronic toys began to appear, battery-powered mechanisms that could move and light up and make sounds. Transistor radios became toys. Walkie-talkies allowed long-distance play, and the boundary between toy and technology began to blur, began to suggest futures where play might involve computers, might involve screens, might involve entirely new forms of interaction. Board games flourished. Monopoly and Scrabble from earlier decades were joined by Risk and Stratego and dozens of others. Games became family rituals, became ways of spending time together, teaching strategy and chance and competition, and the game closet became a fixture of middle-class homes, a library of different rule systems, different worlds to enter. And then came the screens, first small, flickering cathode ray tubes running simple programs, games that were barely more than moving dots and lines, but they were interactive. They responded to input. They created feedback loops that were immediate and compelling, and children were drawn to them with an intensity that concerned parents and delighted manufacturers. Pong appeared in 1972, a game so simple it seems almost absurd now. 2 paddles, a bouncing square, and yet it captivated. It demonstrated that electronic play could be engaging, could be competitive, could fill hours with repetitive action that felt somehow fresh each time. The late 1970s brought home gaming consoles, Atari and others, cartridge-based systems that could play multiple games, and suddenly the television, that screen that had been passive, that had broadcast stories created by others, became interactive, became a space where children could make choices, could control outcomes, could play, and traditional toys continued. They didn't disappear, but they began to share space with these new forms, began to compete for attention, began to adapt. Many toys incorporated electronic elements, dolls that spoke, cars that responded to remote controls, board games with electronic timers and random number generators. Star Wars arrived in 1977, and with it came a merchandising phenomenon that changed the toy industry forever. Action figures representing every character, vehicles and play sets, an entire universe recreated in plastic. And children didn't just want one figure. They wanted to collect them all, wanted to recreate scenes, wanted to extend the story beyond the screen. The concept of the media tie-in became dominant. Toys were no longer standalone objects. They were extensions of stories told elsewhere. on television, in movies, in comic books, and this created powerful synergies. The story sold the toy reinforced the story. Children lived inside these narratives, carried them from screen to floor to playground. Transformers launched in 1984. Toys that were two things at once. Robots that became vehicles, vehicles that became robots, and the transformation itself. The puzzle of converting one form to another became the play, became the satisfaction, and there was a television show, a story, a mythology. But the toys stood alone, were engaging even without the narrative context. Cabbage Patch Kids created a frenzy in 1983. Soft-bodied dolls with yarn hair and unique faces, each one supposedly different, each one coming with adoption papers. And parents lined up, fought in stores, paid inflated prices because their children wanted these specific dolls, wanted to participate in this particular craze, and the psychology of scarcity and uniqueness was revealed, was exploited, was understood as a powerful force. The toy industry had become enormous. Multinational corporations with research departments and focus groups, with sophisticated marketing campaigns aimed directly at children through Saturday morning cartoons, with planned obsolescence and annual model changes. The innocence of the wooden toy workshop was centuries gone, replaced by boardrooms and market analysis and profit margins. But creativity persisted. Small companies still innovated, still created toys that were genuinely novel. The Rubik's Cube appeared in 1980, a puzzle that could be solved but rarely was, that frustrated and fascinated in equal measure, that became a global phenomenon because it was perfectly calibrated, difficult enough to be challenging, simple enough to be approachable. Electronic learning toys emerged, computers designed for children, teaching typing and math and spelling through games, and parents bought them eagerly, hoping that early exposure to computers would provide advantages, would prepare their children for futures that were clearly going to be dominated by technology. The 1990s brought virtual pets, Tamagotchis, digital creatures that lived in small plastic eggs, that required feeding and attention, that would die if neglected, and children carried them everywhere, checked on them constantly, learned about responsibility through the demands of a simulated life. Beanie Babies became a collecting obsession, small stuffed animals filled with plastic pellets, marketed with artificial scarcity, with retirement announcements out with the suggestion that they might be valuable, might be investments, and adults collected alongside children. Prices soared, and the bubble eventually burst. But for a few years they demonstrated the power of collectability, of manufactured desire. The internet changed everything, slowly at first, then rapidly. Online games appeared, multiplayer worlds where children could interact with others across distances, where play became social in new ways, where the playground extended infinitely beyond physical boundaries. Traditional toy companies struggled to adapt. Some failed. Some were absorbed by larger corporations. Some found niches, specialty markets, collector markets. The mass market fragmented. Children's attention fragmented. A child in 2000 had options that would have been unimaginable to a child in 1950. Hundreds of cable channels, video games with photorealistic graphics, websites and early social networks, and traditional toys competing for space among all of these stimuli. But certain toys endured, Lego continued to thrive, adapting, creating licensed sets based on popular movies, creating robotic sets that taught programming, expanding while maintaining the core brick system that had worked for decades, proving that good fundamental design could survive technological change. Action figures evolved, became more articulated, more detailed, developed collector markets among adults. Toy companies realized that nostalgia was powerful, that adults would buy premium versions of toys they'd loved as children, and the line between children's toy and adult collectible blurred. Educational toys became more sophisticated, more research-based. Companies employed child development experts, designed toys that targeted specific skills, spatial reasoning, fine motor control, early literacy, and parents bought these toys hoping to give their children advantages, to optimize development, to ensure success in an increasingly competitive world. The 2000s brought smart toys, toys with chips and sensors, dolls that could recognize voices, robots that could be programmed, construction sets that incorporated motors and computers, and the integration of technology into traditional play patterns accelerated, became expected, became normal. Smartphones and tablets arrived. Touchscreens made computing accessible to even very young children. Apps designed for toddlers appeared, games that were educational, games that were purely entertaining, and screen time became a major parenting concern, became something to be limited, managed, negotiated. YouTube created a new phenomenon. Children watching other children play with toys, unboxing videos where the unwrapping itself became entertainment, and these videos garnered millions of views, influenced purchase decisions, created new categories of toy celebrity, children who became famous for playing. And through all of this, through all these changes and innovations and disruptions, certain fundamental forms persisted. Children still played with dolls, still built with blocks, still rolled balls, still created imaginary worlds with whatever materials were available. The screens and electronics and licensed properties were layers added on top of something ancient, something that predated civilization itself. The 2010s brought a renaissance of traditional toys, a reaction against screen time, against passive consumption. Parents sought out wooden toys again, simple toys, open-ended toys, toys that didn't beep or light up, that required imagination rather than batteries. And small companies emerged to meet this demand, creating beautiful handcrafted toys that echoed those earliest forms. STEM toys became a category. Science and technology and engineering and mathematics, coding toys, chemistry sets redesigned for safety, robotics kits that were accessible, and the goal was explicit: to prepare children for futures in technical fields, to make learning feel like play, to collapse the boundary between education and entertainment. Collectible card games created communities, Pokemon and Magic and others, games that required strategy and deck building, that had competitive scenes and tournaments that children could grow into, could maintain interest in for years, developing expertise, building collections that had real monetary value. And fidget spinners swept through in 2017, simple bearings and weighted arms, toys that did almost nothing, that just spun, and they were everywhere for 6 months, then vanished. A perfect example of how virally a toy trend could spread in the age of social media, and how quickly it could fade. Slime became a phenomenon, homemade slime, tutorial videos showing different recipes, different colors and textures, and children were making their own toys, creating, experimenting, sharing results online. And this felt different, felt participatory, felt like a return to an earlier era when toys were often homemade, when creation was part of play. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted everything, closed stores, disrupted supply chains, locked children at home, and toy sales surged. Parents desperate to occupy homebound children, children desperate for new stimuli, and puzzles sold out, board games sold out, craft kits sold out, anything that could fill time, that could provide relief from screens and boredom and anxiety. And in that strange period, that time of isolation, the role of toys became clearer. They weren't just products, they were tools for emotional regulation, for learning, for maintaining some sense of a normalcy when the world had become abnormal. They were comforts, companions, anchors. As we arrive in the present moment in these current years, the toy landscape is extraordinarily diverse. There are toys incorporating artificial intelligence, toys that can learn and adapt, toys that blur the line between physical and digital. There are subscription boxes delivering curated toys monthly. There are minimalist toys designed by Scandinavian designers. There are mass-market licensed properties and handcrafted wooden heirlooms. Children today have access to more toys than any previous generation, more variety, more sophistication, more choice, and yet the fundamental activities remain: building and nurturing and pretending and competing, the same activities that children in ancient Egypt engaged in, the same impulses expressed through different materials, different technologies, different cultural contexts. And perhaps this is where the history becomes something more, becomes a lens for understanding what changes and what doesn't, what technologies can transform, and what remains essentially human, what all these objects across all these centuries were really doing, what they were really for. Because when we look at toys across this vast expanse of time, when we hold in our minds simultaneously the clay rattle from ancient Mesopotamia and the AI-powered robot of today, we begin to see something profound about human nature, about what we value, about what we protect even in the hardest times. Toys are not necessary for survival. They provide no calories, no shelter, no protection from predators or weather, and yet they appear in every culture, in every era, in households wealthy and poor, in times of peace and times of war. They persist because they serve something essential, something that transcends mere survival. They are tools for becoming human, for learning the skills that culture requires. But they are more than that. They are expressions of love, tangible manifestations of the desire to give children joy, to ease the difficulty of growing up, to provide small, manageable worlds where imagination can roam freely. When a parent in ancient Rome commissioned an ivory doll for their daughter, when a father in medieval Germany carved a wooden horse for his son, when a mother in 1950s America saved money to buy a teddy bear, they were all doing the same thing. They were saying that childhood matters, that play deserves resources, that their child's happiness was worth the effort, worth the cost. And the children who received these gifts across all these centuries experienced something similar, the delight of possession, of having something that was theirs, something made for their hands, their imagination, their particular way of understanding the world. The evolution of toys mirrors the evolution of human capability, from carved wood to molded plastic to programmed silicon. Each technological revolution was quickly adapted to the purpose of play, because adults recognized that children needed to grow up fluent in the materials and methods of their time. But beneath the technological change, beneath the shift from handcraft to mass production to digital integration, the fundamental activities remained constant. Children built structures and knocked them down. They nurtured dolls and stuffed animals. They enacted stories of adventure and conflict and resolution. They practiced being adults while still being children. Toys taught skills, but not always the skills they were designed to teach. A doll might teach nurturing, but it also taught storytelling and emotional processing. A construction set might teach engineering, but it also taught patience and problem solving and the satisfaction of completing difficult tasks. A ball taught physics through the body rather than through equations. And toys connected generations. Grandparents who remembered their own childhoods when they saw similar toys. Parents who bought the modern versions of toys they had loved. Children who discovered that play itself was timeless. That the joy of a toy that responded well to manipulation was the same joy their ancestors had felt. The industrialization of toy production made abundance possible, made variety accessible, but it also created new anxieties about materialism, about spoiled children, about the loss of imagination when toys became too specific, too prescribed in their use, too tied to external narratives, and these anxieties were not new. Roman moralists worried about excessive luxury in toys. Victorian parents fretted about idle play versus improving activities. Mid-century experts warned about television and passivity. Every generation has worried that the new forms of play were somehow corrupting, somehow less valuable than the play of their own childhood. But children have always adapted, have always found ways to play creatively with whatever they were given, have always subverted the intended use of toys, turning dolls into explorers, turning building blocks into characters, turning any object into whatever the game required. The genius of the best toys, the ones that endured across decades, was that they were open-ended. They didn't dictate their own use. A simple wooden block could be a building, a car, a phone, a piece of food, anything, and this openness allowed the child's imagination to lead, allowed play to be truly creative rather than merely imitative. And in our current moment, when toys can be infinitely complex, can respond to voice commands and learn patterns and connect to the internet, there is a recognition that simplicity still has value, that the most sophisticated toy is not necessarily the most valuable, that sometimes what a child needs is something as simple to project their complexity onto. The history of toys is inseparable from the history of childhood itself, from changing ideas about what children are, what they need, what they deserve. In eras when children were seen as miniature adults, toys reflected that. In eras when childhood was understood as sacred and vulnerable, toys became gentler, more protective, and toys marked transitions, the shift from childhood to adolescence, sometimes explicitly, dolls that were put away, toy soldiers packed into storage, sometimes naturally as interests changed, as peer groups became more important than solitary play, as the real world became more engaging than miniature versions of it. but many people never entirely stopped playing, kept collections, built elaborate model railways in their basements, assembled and painted miniature figures, played board games and video games. Because play itself is not something we outgrow. It's something we channel differently, something we disguise with words like hobby and recreation. But it's still play, still the same impulse to engage imaginatively with objects and rules and possibilities. The future of toys is uncertain. Technology will continue to evolve. Virtual reality and augmented reality and technologies not yet invented will create new forms of play, new ways of interacting, new experiences that blur physical and digital even further. But the fundamental human needs that toys address, the need for imagination and creativity and mastery and story, those needs are not changing. They are ancient. They are part of what makes us human. And so toys in some form will persist, will adapt, will continue to be there when children reach for them. And this brings us to the end of this long history, this journey from clay to silicon, from handcraft to algorithm, from the first toy maker whose name we will never know to the vast global industry of today. The story of toys is ultimately a story about care, about the human capacity to think beyond immediate survival, to invest time and skill and resources into objects whose only purpose is joy, is learning through delight, is the enrichment of childhood. Every toy ever made, from the crudest stick horse to the most sophisticated robot, represents someone's effort to give a child something good, something valuable, something that says your play matters. Your imagination deserves materials. Your becoming deserves support. And the children who played with these toys across all these millennia were all doing the same essential work. They were learning to be human, to navigate social relationships, to understand cause and effect, to imagine alternatives to what is, to create and destroy and create again. On a quiet evening, when the day's demands have faded, when there is space to think about such things, I find myself grateful for this history, for the toy makers and the parents and the children, for the persistence of play across every obstacle, for the recognition that childhood deserves beauty, deserves objects made with care, deserves joy. And I imagine all the toys that have ever existed, from the oldest clay rattle to the newest digital companion, arrayed somehow in a vast collection. And what they reveal together is not just technological progress, not just economic history, but something about human nature at its most hopeful, most generous, most oriented toward the future, because toys are fundamentally optimistic. They assume there will be a future for children to grow into. They assume that childhood deserves protection and enrichment. They assume that the next generation matters enough to invest in their development, their happiness, their becoming. And so the story of toys is the story of human hope, expressed in materials, in objects, in the gift of play itself, continuing through every age, adapting to every change, but fundamentally constant, fundamentally human, fundamentally about love made tangible in small things meant for small hands. The night grows deeper, the history settles, and somewhere a child is playing with something old or something new, with wood or plastic or light on a screen, and they are doing what children have always done. They are building worlds, practicing being alive, learning through joy And the long tradition continues, the endless conversation between generations, the gift given forward, the recognition that childhood, with all its wonder and difficulty and potential, deserves toys, deserves play, deserves this particular form of care. And perhaps that is enough to have traced this line through time, to have seen the persistence of this simple, generous impulse to rest here at the end of the story, with the knowledge that tomorrow there will be more toys, more children, more play, more of this ancient, beautiful practice of making joy tangible, making imagination material, making childhood a little easier, a little richer, a little more full of wonder. The history is complete. The circle closes, and we can rest here in this quiet understanding that toys have always been with us and will continue to be, as long as there are children and adults who remember being children, and the shared recognition that play is sacred, that imagination deserves tools, that the work of becoming human begins with small objects held in small hands, in moments of delight, in the eternal present of play, where time dissolves and everything is possible, and the world is made new again and again and again,